Hello, and good afternoon, stroke morning to our Lorebeards Sunday episode. Can you hear us? Are we coming through loud and clear? If you could tell us in the comments that we rock, that would be awesome.
Yep. Hopefully everyone's doing well. Today's going to be a pretty funny good time as we're going to be going back to the gods for the first time in a hot minute.
Yeah.
Though we actually have back-to-back gods, which will be fun, though from very different, two exceptionally different gods, I might note. But yeah, this one's going to be a really good time.
Yeah, so this week it's Rhya, the goddess of fertility, life, and all that good funky stuff. And next Sunday we're going to be diving into Mork and Gork, those good old Greek.
You mean Gork and
gods. Mork? No, I mean Mork and Gork.
He means
Mork and Gork.
Gork and Mork, obviously.
Those gods that are cunning and brutal, or brutal and cunning, depending entirely upon how one appreciates them. So that's next Sunday if you want to watch that one. Again, that'll be at 4 p.m. UK time. Translate that to your local time as best suits. I'm particularly looking forward to today, though, because the goddess Rhya is one that's actually surprisingly close to my personal heart, as we're going to find out when we eventually dive into the intro. Because in the intro, I'll give you a quick rundown as to not just where the goddess came from, what she's meant to Warhammer down through the editions, and why she's relatively important to me as well. So I'm really looking forward to this one. It's a special request episode, actually, because some people who know us get to occasionally do a special request. And this is one from Sotek's side, a special request on his one, which is why we're on his channel doing this one, because it's a special request from one of his bestest buds. So we are looking forward to this one intensely. And also, is it a birthday present?
Yes,
for so my happy birthday.
Yes, for my GM Victor. Yes.
Happy birthday, Victor. You rock, and this stream is for you.
I'm sure he'll be writing on that for a while.
Brilliant.
But yeah, this one I am genuinely excited for this because Rhya is very much, which I'm sure Andy will get into this, but Rhya is a god who's kind of gone through a bit of a weird development in the Warhammer system because she doesn't translate super easily from like the tabletop war game perspective. Mm-hmm. So that has often, yeah, there he is.
No, you rock.
Rhya often was a god that got created, which Andy will get into, but because of her domains, she didn't translate super duper easily into often the focus of Warhammer, which led to her kind of getting buried, really hard.
Appropriately.
And it was always a bit of a bummer from the roleplay side because you would wind up in situations, or if you go back to second edition, she just kind of gets fused with her husband Tal, the god of nature, and to the point that it was often in second edition.
You're getting into all my intro here.
Well, you've got a lot more depth to go. All I'm gonna say is that this stream is really good for everyone out there that really enjoys the lore of humanity, especially because we're gonna be prying those two apart and getting into what they're supposed to be, which is genuinely separate entities. They're not meant to be the same. Just like if you're playing around with your elves, you know, the Aisha and Kurnos are not supposed to be the same. But yeah, we never got a ever queen of humanity, so we never got the big focus there, which is a bummer. Though I do hope that maybe one day, with like the way the Empire lore is going, you know, we might get to see more examination on like what's going on in Talabecland, which might lead to something, but it's hard to say.
It might. Who can say? You never can be certain how Games Workshop will develop their own background, because sometimes they pick things up and run in entirely new directions that are super cool and awesome. You're just left going, that's great. Other times they just ignore large swaths of what used to be there and don't overwrite it. They just ignore it entirely. And you're just left with very little or patchy background. And then a White Dwarf article might come along later and just add the word Rhya, for example, in one tiny little article. So the goddess clearly still exists, but in the battle game is just never mentioned. So yeah, I think this will be a fun one because This is a story that certainly is going to go a few places. The intro, though, will of course cover that. Will we dive into our first few super chats as they've started coming in?
Yep, we could do that. Charles in fantasy. Oh, geez, we're starting off with a. We're starting off
exactly
one of
where
these.
I went. I was like, oh wow.
Are the gods formed from the psychic energy of mortals pre-exist those thoughts, or both? Do gods predate the old ones, or did the old ones make them?
Charles CK, what a question. Okay,
yes.
So the answer to this is long, in-depth, complicated, and contradictory. And that's because the number of writers involved is long, complicated, and let's be honest, they've contradicted each other multiple times in the past. Loosely speaking, right at the very beginning of Warhammer's time, when we're dealing with the first Realms of Chaos books, and they're diving for the first time into attempting to describe what their gods are, the answer to this question was relatively simple. And the answer was yes to most of this, in that they were formed from the belief of mortals, from the minds of mortals, and what those minds and souls did over into this cosmic reflective other dimension that's sometimes called the aether or the warp or whatever else you want to call it. The great churning of emotions and the movements of the soul caused movements and swirls and created entities on the other side that were everything from tiny spirits right up to massive gods. And the swirling of these entities eventually caused the cataclysm. So they did predate the old ones, in that they predated the old ones and the cataclysm. But did they predate the old ones' arrival? That is something that is debated deeply, both in setting and out. For example, some versions of the setting make it quite clear that the great light, this beaming gates of chaos sitting at the top and the bottom of the world, the first gates that the old ones made, were like shining lights to entities that lived in the warp long before the old ones came. And they swum up to it and they tried to break into reality. And in many respects, they're the first burgeoning examples of the chaos gods as they attempt to break down the world. But other backgrounds say different things. So our answers for this one, Charles, are going to have to be by almost definition loose, because they are answered in different ways in the setting. And ultimately, for your game, the answer is going to be what you think works best. That doesn't mean you're right. That doesn't mean that someone who thinks differently to you is wrong. It just simply means there are different answers. So going through it, in fantasy, so we're not 40k here, nice and simple, are gods formed from the psychic energy of mortals? They can be. Pre-exist those thoughts? They can. Or both. Yes, both is definitely the case with different versions of the background. Do the gods predate the old ones? Yes. Or did the old ones make them? Controversial. Some answer to this with yes, and some answer to this with no. But I can definitively state a couple of things on the yes-no argument here, and that's that the elves are part of the old ones' plan, and the elf gods are part of that too. So you could easily answer, if you took that as read, as simply yes. But when we go to the end times and we find out what the elf gods are, which bluntly blew my mind at the time for how much it contradicted everything we had before, but if we go with that, then they predate the whole lot. They come from another place entirely. And the answer is clearly no, they don't predate the old ones. I mean, pardon me, yes, they do predate the old ones. The old ones didn't make them. That's the no I meant. But they are almost certainly part of the old ones' plan. So the answer to all of this is there are too many answers, and this is a different stream to the one we're doing.
Yeah, literally all that. Just play around with it. This is the only thing I'll add is that this is, and I think kind of hinted at this. This is one of those questions that tends to be much easier to answer in the 40k setting as opposed to the fantasy setting, because the fantasy setting just has oodles and oodles more gods than 40k does. 40k is a galaxy bereft of gods, whereas fantasy is a planet that is drowning in them. But yeah, Sean, what is the difference between Rhya and the elf goddess of fertility, which would be Aisha? Are there any elves that worship Rhya? And y'all are just starting off with like the most controversial questions.
So, Sean, this one's really, really, really easy. And the answer to this is, what do you want for your world? Because the writers contradict on this also. So after the last question, where I had to do a lot of preamble to say, writers contradict each other, this one's easy to answer because we had the last one. And the answer is either, yes, they're just the same God. And I'm going to argue that that is what most of the writers suggest, because even Rhya is known by multiple names across the old world. So yes, they're basically just the same God expressing in different ways. The term elf God is a great fallacy. It's just God. And that God is worshipped all over the world, not just the old world, not just amongst the elves, but all over the world under different guises. Or the answer is they're two completely separate gods, and they are worshipped differently by elves and humans. The answer, according to most writers, is they are all the same deity being accessed or tapped in different ways by different species. But that is contradicted deeply by some other writers too. So again, Sean, the answer is kind of up to you for your game.
Yeah, what I'll add is the big thing to think about, that's fun to think about, especially for your setting, that's never directly tackled, especially because the true nature of the gods is a topic that should have been tackled in the end times, and it just wasn't. They just didn't deal with it because they just didn't have time, to be frank. And the few times that they did deal with it, they came up with some rather bizarre answers that don't make any sense. I'll say very bluntly. So there's nothing helpful over there. So you kind of have to answer it for yourself. And the big thing is, I very much, even though I agree very much with Andy that most of the evidence is going to suggest that they're the same gods. But what gets fun is trying to figure out for your world why they express differently with like the different races and groups and cultures, to the point that like humanity like manifests these weird miracle things and the elves don't do that. And why is that? You know, why are there gods that have had these very faithful communities among a different species, but now seem to work differently with humans, to the point that you could argue in universe that there would be scholars that say, oh, well, obviously they're not the same god, because that elf god over there is different. She doesn't do the things our god does. And trying to figure out why is that the case. That's the great mystery lurking in the background of the setting.
I agree, and there is a question there that is waiting for an answer, and if you're looking for something fun to explore, it's well worth doing so in your games. I know Lawhammer has already started that exploration as to what the differences or the commonalities are, so if you want to watch that, feel free, but it is hundreds and hundreds of hours to get to this particular piece of content, and it's a piece of content that can become more important as we head towards the end.
Yep. Ro says, the breeding king aspect of Slaanesh has come to Lorebeards. No, bad, no.
Squirt. I'm getting water in your face.
I'd like to ask about marriage rights of the Empire and how important it is for children to be born to married parents. Well, so, okay, first of all, although I very much suspect that this was a meme comment, it is very much worth addressing that in the Warhammer world, sex is completely normal and an important part of life. And one of the greatest enemies of Slaanesh is Rhya, because Slaanesh is not a god of sex at all. Slaanesh is a god of excess in all of its forms. Now, sex is something that is very easy to take to excess, especially for
societies that are prudish, like Sigmarites.
Yeah, and especially for our culture, especially in the West at the time, especially when Warhammer was being written, for our culture, when we're trying to think of a way to show people indulging in excess or addiction, sex is a really easy one to think of like, oh, look how deplorable those people are being having sex in public. It's
all about taboos and transgression and breaking taboos, and Slaanesh is deeply tied to much of that. And one of Rhya's core duties is going to be tackling this, but we'll discuss that later. In this one, marriage rights across the Empire are different. Each one of the gods has got different ways of expressing that. Not all gods have marriage rights, but many do. Some of them are polyamorous. Some of them are just simple family units. The Cult of Sigmar is relatively simple. Two get together, they build a unit, they defend themselves against the depredations of outside coming in. Where we go with Manan, they'll marry entire ships together so that should any of them die at sea, they will all share the pensions as they come back together. So that's ships and all of their families back at port. There's different ways of handling marriage in the Empire, but generally something relatively medieval and handfasty is very common. You'll find everything from throwing jugs at each other to making oaths to the gods beneath an open sky. You name it, it happens somewhere in the Empire because it's a place full of local traditions, all of which are different. Some of which are deemed to be based on survival. That's the only thing that matters. So man and woman bonding together in a unit. Others where it's far more broad. Literally anyone can marry anything under any circumstance and nobody cares. It's a big empire and all different types of views will be expressed somewhere.
Yeah, my favorite will always be the Manon boat marriages. Those ones are super funny because you could just, it's so like,
they're based on real life.
Oh, that's so funny. That's so good.
Because I wrote part of this into the setting because there was, it came to court cases in the UK where entire communities were effectively marrying themselves, and they had to change it from because they were using wedded language, and they had to change all the language so it became a business contract. So the entire ship would marry everyone else's wife. So when the crew came home, if anybody had died, the pension was shared out amongst the families for each of them to effectively protect them all against the extreme dangers of the sea. And then the naval contracts then moved over to fishing contracts. So all the fishing groups would help each other. And effectively, it just created big communities that all work together. So yeah, we copied that over. Some really weird crazy stories in Scotland that I particularly liked that I sort of modified and pasted down because I felt it felt really Mannonite. But yeah, that's a small aside and not really this stream.
Great stuff. Morning to Crescent. I always adore the quiet gods and goddesses of the world. So Rhya has always been the goddess of the old world I've had a special soft spot for. No jokes from me this stream. I actually care about this one. I mean,
yeah, me
fair.
Too. I care about this one a lot, Mornington Crescent, so I'm with you.
Yeah. And yeah, great. Awesome. The Blood Person, think that during the stream you'll mention the cult of Ahalt the Drinker.
There's no real need to do so. Ahalt is a god that has some connections to Rhya, but most gods at some point or another do. So if we talk about some of the connections, particularly with the Talites spreading their way across the old world and slaughtering the worshippers of other gods as they went, there's a great belief that the Teutigans and the Umberigans, so that's the Sigmarites, if you will, of Reichland, and the Elricans of the north, are the primary warlike groups of the empire. They absolutely aren't. The Telutans, so that's the Talabic landers, in the center of the empire, were arguably the most warlike of them all, in that they were constantly going to war with and eventually separated themselves from the empire for over 1,000 years. They were a completely separate empire with their own views on religion. And a lot of their views was Tala's best and all the rest of your religions suck. And we're going to murder you if you don't agree. So Ahalt the Drinker falls into this. Her entire cult got massacred by the Talites. There's lots of fun details of the lore, but I think it's better left for an Ahalt the Drinker stream because it's a super fascinating deity.
Skylar Martin, if priestly miracles come from their gods through the ether, do priests see the winds of magic? Also, do wizards see the winds 24/7, or is it more of an on-off thing?
Okay, so this one's really easy, Skylar. The priests don't see the winds of magic, although it's possible they may get a talent that allows them to do so. So some of them and some witch hunters have been cursed or blessed, depending on the deity at hand, with the ability to see one or more of the winds of magic. So the answer to this is no, they don't. They're not doing spells. They're not drawing in the winds of magic, nor are they using them. They perceive the world through an entirely different paradigm, which is one of faith, one of gods, one of theophanies, one of religious excess or religious point of view, loosely speaking. So they can often see religiosity. They can often see the faith of others or feel the faith of others. They can feel holy ground. And similar effects for the wizards would be seen in a very different way. A wizard may see a great rush of Heish in the area, which is often perceived to be as holiness by the wizards. So they don't see the same stuff. They perceive the world very differently. Lastly, do wizards see the winds 24/7 or is it on off? It's more of a concentration thing. It's a little bit like clenching your buttocks. Most writers say that they can control it to a degree, and when there's too much winds in the area, they can no longer control it. It assaults their senses. It's far beyond what they can control. But normally it's just ticking along in the background, and it's like when you go into a crowd, and you can hear that crowd all the time, and it's constantly going. And yeah, the crowd's there, but you don't hear any individual voices until you listen. And then you listen and you listen into an individual conversation around you. And suddenly you can pick out the individual conversations. The winds of magic are somewhat different. It's not always on, as in they're not constantly assaulted, but they're aware of it all the time. And when they focus, they can see the individual things that they're looking for. So imagine it like a crowd and homing in on the individual sounds in a crowd, and at least you're at a good place to go with. But do note, different writers will handle this differently. Some writers are convinced it should be on all the time. Some writers, particularly role-play game writers, hate this because many of the winds of magic dwell within their bad guys, and it's detectable. So what they do is they say, no, it's not on all the time. You have to actually look because they're scared the big bad guy of their plot will be revealed before the plot is concluded. So they rewrite the world to match their adventures instead of rewriting their adventures to match the world. So you'll find there are some contradictory sources out there, meaning that there is some movement here according to what you prefer to do for your game, and you won't be contradicting the background. But broadly speaking, most wizards will see most of the stuff, particularly when it flashes up and flares around them. In the same way that if you're in a giant crowd, you don't hear what everyone's talking about. But if someone shouts fire, everyone turns around and looks at the person shouting fire. That's like some great spout of magic raising up. You don't need to be concentrating on that conversation over here to hear someone shout fire. It's just louder. It's there. It's prevalent. They don't need to switch on their senses to see that part. It's always on, so to speak.
Yeah, I always prefer to think of it as just essentially being another sense of imagining that if you like, you could see things all the time, but if something catches your attention because it's like a quick piece of movement or it's like a particularly bright color or something, if you could focus your sense of sight to focus on something and it changes the way you perceive, just the same way if you're tasting something, your brain is capable of focusing any sense that you have to basically refine it to start picking out more important details, whether that's smell, sight, hearing, whatever. Though I do think the listening in a crowd analogy is always the best one, especially because, yeah, and it works just as well for if there's too much, where like if something happens where the sound becomes absolutely outrageous, it will drown out everything else. And it's like the only thing you're capable of perceiving, and it hurts. If like, there's like a sudden explosion or like a really high pitched ring or something. But yeah.
Yep.
Sigmeister, Priestess Shaki of Rhya, whose hips don't lie. Yep.
Sure, Sigmeister.
Sure. Yep, indeed. Jack Flanagan's greetings. Thanks to Andy and Sotek. I have a deep love for this setting. Well, thanks so much. Recently, while running a game Wolfert, one of my PCs rolled an 88 while trying to channel magic. Ooh, bummer. I had a greater elemental of Gur appear as a result. Harsh, but okay. Just
ouch.
Ooh, bloody Heidsman. Here you go.
Brilliant.
Bummer for them. Jack, also thank you both so much for the great conversations these weeks. I always look forward to them. We do too.
Yeah, it's always a good way to chill at the end of a long week, and it has been a super busy one for me this week. So yeah, it's gonna be nice to have a good chat about something I really like.
Tinsel Domain, do children born from the miracle Rhya's union have anything special about them? Also, why was this miracle included in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th Edition?
Okay, so no is the answer to this. They are just births like any other. But the answer can also be yes if you want it to be. There is nothing that is hard written into the miracle that says there's any difference at all. So the answer is broadly no, but as we all know, when magic's involved, we definitely could have a difference. And in this case, it's divine magic, for want of a better description. Why was it included in Warhammer 4? Because it's important that spells that aren't just about kicking living crap out of each other are included, because a lot of people play Warhammer in a way that others don't. For example, they play campaigns that are primarily focused on social interactions or discovery or investigation or just social life in a way that is not necessarily reflected by a set of spells that, like D&D, are all about what happens in combat. It's important that these deities have broader spells that reflect what they actually do. And at heart, Rhya is a goddess of fertility. Why the heck wouldn't you include that miracle in? It absolutely makes sense.
Yeah, it's like, yeah, obviously this isn't in 99.9 to the infinitesimal degree going to be relevant to what the typical party will be doing through a campaign, but you never know what kind of stories will come up, and you never know.
It's a story in and of itself.
Yeah.
So it makes a great adventure hook for a GM too. It's a tool like any other to tell broader, more interesting stories. In some respects, look at it as nothing more than I could use that. How can I use it?
Yeah, it's almost like an adventure hook in a prayer. Especially like if you're playing with a group that's like very, very historically minded, someone that has a deep fascination with like how cultures dealt with childbirth, because it is for humans a pretty goddamn dangerous thing, which can make Rhya like significantly more valuable if you're actually thinking about the setting itself, especially because if anything, childbirth could be more dangerous in the Warhammer world than our world because of how magic can influence things. And for humans, it's already not the easiest process and was a major aspect of women's mortality. Even today, even today, childbirth is fucking dangerous. So having a god that's able to like genuinely step in and make the process significantly more survivable and easier is a huge thing from a
We never will change. It's how we run. It's how we roll. To make sure that you got it, we have a nice long chat because you tend to find that most of the people who are watching us don't arrive until approximately half an hour to an hour in. So we like to give everybody their opportunity to turn up. It's a Sunday. People are kicking out, having a cup of tea or their roast lunches or whatever. So we ease in gently, then we go wild.
Yeah. On the side, listening to Lorebeards helps me restart my world building game project. Thank you so much. On gods, is Nurgle associated with pollution? Not directly, correct? So generally speaking, this is actually kind of one of those funny ones where like from what has been often written about, not really, but when you think about it, he should be.
Yeah. I mean, pollution at its heart is all about the degradation of the surrounding world in a way that will make it pestilential to live within. So pollution is often the first steps towards Nurgle manifesting. So absolutely, an association, definitely, and a tool that we use by some Nurgle worshippers to get the outcomes they're looking for. After all, pollution makes disease more likely. So yeah, sure. It's just one tool amongst many. It'd be like saying, is war associated with corn? Yeah, because lots of blood is spilled there. And so, yes, but he's not a war god per se.
Yeah, it boils down to that is a tool in his toolbox, and it's something he can benefit from. And you might find some rare cults amongst Nurgle that specialize in this form of spreading corruption.
Yeah, sure.
Necromancer Kobold, I think it would be a good couple stories that Rhya would be popular with homosexual couples as well as trans women, both of whom want children. In their own ways.
Indeed. I'll possibly enlighten this as we move through the stream because we are dealing with a fantasy world where certain realities that are not available in the real world can become a thing. And homosexuality, people who have gender dysphoria, and trans people, and a variety of others are going to be a core component of life across the old world and indeed the world as a whole, because the people express in different ways, no matter what people try to think from the outside. and there will be real solutions and answers that are different to real world options. So I think all of these things could very much be the case, particularly when it comes to some things like having children. Indeed, that's even been a component of Lawhammer with certain couples who have had kids in methods that would not normally be allowed, purely because of things like jade magic and fertility goddesses and gods, because they come in different ways. So agree.
Laughing, and like Andy said, we'll be getting into that stuff. Rhya seems like a foundational deity for community as well as the natural world. Would her importance be comparable to, say, Valea for the dwarfs?
No. And I'll discuss this as I move into the broader introduction, because Rhya takes up a slightly different place because her original pitch was different. And when I discuss that, you'll kind of see why Rhya doesn't have that same core hold over all of the community that, say, Valea absolutely does.
Hammond, what app do gods use to date other gods, Rhya?
What apps I reference to? I presume it's a reference to one of them. I'm not getting it.
I don't know. There's
too
so
old
many
to know what you're referencing.
So many. Naturally, a halt is a tall order. A tall order?
I just want to bring up the comment here from Joseph because it made me smile. Played my first game of Dark Deeds last night over a couple of pints with 2 players. It was engaging and ended with a neck and neck final favorite totals of 58-59. So close, Joseph. It's a great game. If you haven't bought Dark Deeds already, you should absolutely do so. You can buy it right now from Modiphius.com or modiphius.co.uk, and my name is all over the place in the back of it because it's a great game.
Unseen Archives. Hi, Lorebeards. On the subject of classical gods and our hammer, we've decided that Shalian priestesses carry out gender-affirming surgery for transgender folks. Thought you'd like it.
I think that's interesting on Unseen Archives, but Shalia is not really one for surgery. Now, admittedly, there are some depictions of surgery in Shalians, particularly when it's all bloody and there's bits and pieces that they might be sitting around. But Shalians are much more about praying and miracles and relying upon faith in Shalia to allow mercy to occur and you enduring the horrors of war or the horrific wounds you have than actually diving in with a knife. That's more the realm of barber surgeons. And you might think, oh, wouldn't doctors do that? No, the physicians think that getting into the flesh is, generally speaking, the work of a butcher, not the work of a doctor. Historically speaking, doctors' guilds didn't do surgery until really, really late in the day. It was left to things like barber surgeons' guilds. And barber surgeons in particular used to have often a lot of vying competition with doctors as to who should do what sort of work. So this one here, I think it's great that you've figured out a method of dealing what you want to do with your transgender folks in your game. I don't think I would personally choose Shalia as the route to do that, but that's a personal choice and purely because I don't generally use Shalia with surgery. But if that's what you're doing with your Shalia, I don't just think this is great. I think it's amazing, but it's also potentially very, very dangerous.
Yeah. What I kind of find interesting here is I think that could be a fun way to have would be an interesting way to explore more controversial cults within the cult of Shalia itself. There are individuals that decide to try and take a more direct hand in bringing like a direct form of mercy and healing as opposed to the prayer system, which would cause conflict within the cult. There would be people that would have deep and vicious arguments about it, which would lead to some interesting storytelling.
Yeah, I agree. The cult of Shalia in particular has many fundamentalists who believe that suffering is a core component of being a follower or someone who is an adherent to Shalia. So they often think that suffering is a good thing for their patients. So do be aware that that's something that some extremists also might consider. So getting some conflict into your cult of Shalia is always a good thing.
Yep. Actually, just off the top of my head, there is a genuinely interesting Shalian character that appears like a blink and you'll miss it moment at the start of the Archaon novels, who is shown to actually use forms of treating people's injuries in the form of like actual treatment of like getting her hands bloody and in there and stuff. And in one of the possible timelines, she accidentally kills Archaon during one of the surgeries, and it's this interesting moment that because you're getting kind of like Bellacor's point of view, Shalia gets angry with her for killing someone, but at the same time, she is killed and ever chosen. So like the gods are happy with her, but she has this horrible, deep crisis because she believes that she's just killed an innocent man. And it's this whole thing, and it's actually a really, really interesting perspective. But it's really just a blinking you'll miss it moment in the book. But it's a good moment.
I want to bring up a comment from on this side here because I think there is a little bit of extra discussion that's worth just dropping quickly before we move on from this. Shallion Turfs going around force-feeding people gender dysphoria juice so that they can suffer 24/7 is evil. Laugh my ass off. And you're right, it is. And the real world is filled with lots of different opinions that express in different ways. Now, would this sort of thing happen? Probably, but you might not want to include it in your game, particularly if you've got any transgender players who have to deal with this on a daily basis. If you are dealing with that, you don't want your fantasy world, your route to escapism, to also be throwing stuff at you that makes your life super hard. Because a lot of us are playing these games to have fun, and that becomes deeply unfun. So be very aware of whenever you're adding something that brings extra bigotry to your games that might also get real world responses from your players who are facing some of these bigoted views on a daily basis. So whilst I agree that this is actually not just something that likely would happen, but would make for perhaps some great stories, it's something you have to use with sensitivity and with deep care. But
yeah, just remember that all of the different factions are capable of expressing like a really nasty form of themselves.
Oh yeah, I'm trans. If I included this, I'd probably make them super incompetent losers who keep getting their asses beat. Nice one on this side.
Yeah.
So yeah, totally. So obviously, my warning, perhaps less of an important disclaimer to add for yourself.
Pormisia, greetings. We know except Shalia HD, the deity in the Empire Pantheon has his own dedicated knightly order. Should we include / exclude Rhya in that regard?
See, I think that trying to make every single god have something that works on the Warhammer battlefield is both great and also terrible, because it ends up homogenizing them all, and you lose some of the spikiness and interesting uniqueness of each one of the deities. Rhya is not a war goddess. She's not about knights and going to war and doing it. She works in a completely different way. My personal preference would be to never do this and leave it for Tal to cover that sort of ground. But I fully understand people who would like to include that sort of thing.
Yeah, there is there's an artist on various social media I follow named Binky who has this really concept that always makes me laugh, where in his universe he has like essentially Knights of the Harvest, where each knightly order is based like on a different type of fruit or vegetable. So like there's House Carrot, which is their main thing is carrots, and like so their armor has like these vegetable themes, but they're genuinely terrifying. Like they're not fun and goofy like they kind of are, but when they actually throw down, they're horrifying creatures. Given
the time, we should speed through our next few and then just get diving in, I think.
Oh yeah, you're right.
So
all I'll
let's
say is
few.
I agree with Andy, but if you're going to do a knightly order of Rhya, it should be something kind of over the top and goofy, in my opinion. Cole Patterson, how inspired is Rhya by Rhya? She seems more Demeter.
Intro.
Cool. Stephen Lucas, other Empire gods similarly, but not as much as 7 out of 8/9 divines in Elder Scrolls, overshadowed by demons and don't get badass priest characters. Warhammer gods handled better than Elder Scrolls gods.
I'm Stephen. I think I agree, although I'm not quite sure. I definitely got the point you're making.
Yeah, feel free to add on that.
Yes, I agree. And that the Warhammer world has dealt with their gods better because of that, because not everything is overshadowed by the others.
On the side, only one can defeat Shawn Michaels. Rhya Ripley.
Yeah.
Hieronymus, happy Sunday and praise be Hashtag our ancestor god. Yep. Chaos Wars are back.
Oh, that was something that made me smile. The confirmation that Hashtag over Age of Sigmar is an ancestor god. That made me smile because that's what we suggested he should be.
Yeah, Lorebeards predicted the future.
Controversial when we suggested it too.
Yes, it was. Corvus King, dumb question, are the male priests of Rhya? Stay tuned.
Yes.
But yes.
Not a dumb question at all.
Black Sigil Studios, loving the content, guys. Thank you so much for doing this. Well, thank you for being here, because otherwise it would just be us sitting here yapping
warbling by ourselves.
Yeah.
We'd probably still be doing it because we can't help ourselves. All right, time for us to dive into our introduction.
Yep.
Rhya, goddess of life, fertility, and ... And you'll understand why I say ... in a moment, because this goddess is a fine example of Games Workshop's development of something that has gone oddly awry at different points and ended up with different versions of the same thing being presented in different books. But before we dive into that, let's go all the way back to the beginning when the goddess was first added to Warhammer. This one's really easy because the goddess Rhya is mostly a story of Warhammer Fantasy roleplay, because Rhya barely touches the Warhammer battle game at all. And I do mean barely. You'll hardly ever see a mention of Rhya in the various tomes of war that you will find for Warhammer through editions 3 all the way up to 8 and what lies beyond. The occasional mention of her is about the most you will ever get. As to why that's the case, I'm about to tell you. But right at the very beginning, Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition had an entire section written about the gods. Now, this section was given to Graham Davis to put together. And Graham Davis, who many of you might know already, he's a Warhammer writer from both the past and all editions of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay at one point or another. A great friend of mine. I've hired him to do stuff because he kicks ass. He also helped me set up the Rookery, which was also super cool. Graham was tasked with building a unique set of gods for the Warhammer world. Now, Graham was a great lover of real-world classical mythology. So he dived into his extensive knowledge about that to start building up his version of the gods. But he also moved into everything that had been written for Warhammer so far. And there had been nothing written for the Earth Goddess equivalent for Warhammer. So he put pen to paper and penned out the first tiny little description of Rhya for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition. Now, I've discussed this entry with him because I'm going to say it as bluntly as I can, thought it was wholly unsatisfactory. Nowhere near enough was written about it for such a potentially key deity. And you might go, why, Andy? They had all these other ones. Why is this one key? Because the Earth Goddess, in reality, in most religions, is super important. But also, the Earth Goddess often gets supplanted. If we look at real-world equivalents, it's typically by a sky god of some type or another. Go look at your various theological trees of gods in history if you want to go do that yourself. But typically, Earth Goddesses, the Earth Mother, is supplanted and replaced with other gods as agriculture expands and a more formalized way of dealing with nature takes root over the wildness of the Earth Mother that sits there beforehand. So we ended up with a very simple, basic one. And Graham quite freely admitted, I really wish I'd done more. Because it's such a core component of what was going to be the faith at that time. Because Rhya, as she was written all the way back in the first edition, was directly tied to the old faith as well. That's the original faith of the human tribes before all the other gods came along. And the old faith, at its heart, had the mother, Rhya, at the forefront. She was the central deity, the Earth Mother, the Mother. And the old druids, which would later become the Jade Order of Wizards in the Empire, all of the old peoples like the Belthani or the ones that had come from Albion from across the waters and had spread their form of religion, were all centered around this Earth Mother. She was the original core human deity, all the other deities sort of swimming around that on the edges. And Graham didn't write much. And indeed, as we move through Warhammer, you'll find that not only did he write much, but as the first expansions for Rhya come out, all they do is dilute her. If we take, for example, how Rhya is presented inside the very first Enemy Within campaign book. So in the Enemy Within campaign book, all the way back in the late 80s, they had a quick discussion of all of the gods in the Empire so that you could then present these gods and these cults for your version of the Enemy Within when you played through it. And Rhya got such a small write-up, you'd think, surely they'd just repeat what they did, but with fewer words. Oh, no, they didn't. They instead went, yeah, Rhya is Rhya, but is also known by other names elsewhere, such as Haleth in the north, who is a goddess of hunting. Oh, we're diluting Rya's core central points already. Great. And is also known as Dyrath in Reichland. And Dyrath is another name for Rhya. And she's sort of also a goddess of fertility. A few short sentences, and they basically say, not only is Rhya a sub-goddess that we don't know much about because we didn't write much about her, although tied to arguably some of the most important concepts that the Old Faith are dealing with, but also she's known by lots of different names who aren't different goddesses, and these different goddesses often have completely different spheres of influence. So Rhya's, right from the beginning, Rhya's sphere of influences spreads out as it becomes not just an earth goddess, but also a goddess of hunting, a goddess of chasing down animals, which is really different to the core concept of a goddess of hunting. So we then look at what happens with Rhya throughout the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, and the answer is fuck all. Basically, they do almost no extra development at all. This is it. This is all we have. She is the Earth Mother. She's super important. She's also known by a bunch of other names, and they just leave it. What typically happened was the material from Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay First Edition was picked up by the war game, and then they used that as core concepts for new units in their game. And we got everything from Morian Knights to White Wolves of Ulrich to a whole bunch of other cool stuff that got dropped in the battle game. But Rhya, as Earth Mother, an Earth Mother who was rarely mentioned in the books, was never picked up by Warhammer. At best, it was, and Rhya exists out there somewhere. So when we eventually reach Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition, so we're now into the noughties, we have a goddess who is not mentioned at all in Warhammer. And indeed, at this point, so before Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd Edition comes out, the conversation online is Rhya doesn't exist. This god has been retconned by Games Workshop. It just doesn't exist and should never be a part of Warhammer again. It's in the same province as gnomes. It's in the same province as pygmies. It's in the same province as something that has died and we no longer look to. However, when the 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay came about, the writer for the religious section in there, can't remember if that was TS or Chris off the top of my head. I think it might have been Primus who did that part. TS might have done that. Doesn't matter who did it. But I think it might have been TS. They re-examined the cults as they were presented in the first edition of the game. And that included Rhya. But she was given such a subliminary position that when they created the new version for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition, they just combined her cult with Tal's and said that there's this great cult that used to be separate with Tal and Rhya, the old Earth Mother, and Tal came along and subsumed it. A lot of people hated this because it got rid of one of the great feminine deities of Warhammer, and there were very few feminine-facing deities in Warhammer at this time because as it came out, they just kind of didn't develop those ones, but did develop the big boys and their big guns, meaning that a lot of the female-facing deities had just vanished, and Warhammer felt less because of that. And by combining the cults, it felt a little bit like, seriously, have we lost something? But it was also a really good story that was reflective of the real-world religions as well, because often these old cults of the Earth Mother were just completely overwritten and subsumed by later cults. And this is something that gets picked up by several of the books. Sigmar's Heirs picks this up. Tome of Salvation, to a degree, picks this up. And the concept of the cult of Rhya being effectively conquered by the cult of Tal became a thing out of expediency as later writers looked at the combination of Tal and Rhya and went, how can I make this make sense and still give Rhya some sort of individual voice? So throughout 2nd edition, it became the cult of Tal and Rhya. The cult of Tal, as presented inside the first edition of the game, was gone. The cult of Rhya, as presented in the first edition of the game, was gone. Instead, we had a combined cult. If we were looking at the elven gods in comparison, it would be Isha and Kurnos, and saying that they are combined as Ishernos, effectively as a god. And this became part of the writing for Tal and Rhya, where some writers went, you know what? They were always worshipped as Ishernos. And some writers keep this going to this day, and I think is to the detriment of Rhya. I'll get to that in a moment. So an idea of Ishernos is added to the writing concerning the cult of Tal and Rhya. This idea that Tal and Rhya are combined as a single deity. And the name that they carry is much more elven than it is human. And it's this concept of Ishernos, the combined deity. Yet still, throughout the second edition of the game, Rhya has a whole bunch of other names throughout most of the Grand Provinces. Haletha comes up for the first time. It pops up in some Black Library books as well. It pops up as a god of Nordland, which is very close to the original Haleth. And she's not necessarily a god of hunting. She is also represented as a god of the menstrual cycle, a god of fertility in different ways. Haleth's mount is added inside Empire at War, which is a book from Black Library, one of their big background books about big battles that ever happened, and that's in the Talabheq land section when the Talabheq landers very first declare independence from the Empire with Empress Attilia. And Haleth's Mount is added as a mountain in the background of one of those things. Again, another reference to Rhya, but in a local sense. It was also added to the Talabheq book. So what's the name of the second edition Talabheq book again? That's Terra and Talabheim. Terra and Talabheim, where it was added to some of the maps in there. So again, Haleth's Mount was added to that one. Another reference to Rhya. But Rhya was effectively subsumed throughout this entire period. Again, if we move over to the battle game, nothing. If we move over to the extended Warhammer licenses, novels, comics, nothing more than the occasional, oh, blessed be Rhya, or Rhya's tits, or something. And that's it. There is nothing else about her. We hit the third edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. Third edition Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay was a very different game to the games that had come before it. Very, very different, completely different system. It used cards. It had completely different dice. It was a different game. And they took a far more almost broad view of Warhammer as a whole. And when we look at Cult of Tal and Rhya, it was basically copy-pasted. And with what I think was a relatively nice implementation of it in third edition, you tend to find the spells were either one side Tal, the other side Rhya, so that's the divine magic they could do, because the game often worked off of an aggressive or a passive stance, with different dice used in different examples. And the aggressive players of Tal and Rhya were all Tal, and the more defensive players, when you flipped it over, were all Rhya. And that was a really nice implementation of it. But again, the two gods, the two cults, are completely pulled together, and you tend to find most of the writing sort of does short shrift to the Ryan part of it. It's generally Tal, 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 bit of Rhya, Tal, 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 bit of Rhya. And so she continues to be there in the background. Mentions of the old faith and her importance to it are in the background, but very little additional material making her unique and new are added. And then finally we hit the fourth edition of the game. Now, when I was compiling the religious section for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4th edition, a conversation was had directly with Games Workshop. I'd had a pass from Graham Davis already to effectively re-examine all of the gods again, and Graham had sent over one without Rhya included at all. His first draft had Rhya as a mention, a discussion, could be mentioned, but had been combined with Tal in the past, so it was probably best going as Tal and Rhya these days in this way to do it. And I immediately went, nah. If we do that, we're going to be left with 0 female deities in here. And out of our playtest groups that we had, there was a lot of people asking for more, particularly on the female-facing deities. So I was like, yeah, no, I'm not happy with this. But Games Workshop might prefer it to be Tal and Rhya as a group. And it's not my decision that matters here. It's what Games Workshop wants that matters. It's their IP. So I immediately got in contact with Games Workshop and I said, basically, I'll summarize the conversation. Hi, said I. This is the situation that we have for the cults of the Empire. I think Rhya should be separated out and have her own cult separate from the cult of Tal. I think it's super important because what she does is so very different to what Tal does. They are very, very different deities. And here's why I think they're different. Now, I didn't give a big, long screeds because nobody wants to have bombarded info dumps in their email box. I just dropped a quick sentence about each, which was a quick summary of what they were and why I thought they should be discrete. I then explained why I thought they could also be combined, because it's important that if that's what they want, that I show that I'm happy to support it, do whatever is required. But why I thought they should be separated was I figured a worthwhile argument to have. And I got a comeback saying, yeah, this sounds great. Yeah, really love that idea. Run with Rhya being its own thing. Write that up and we'll read it. And if we agree, yeah, brilliant. But as it currently stands, I agree completely with you. This is how it should be done because they agreed. There was a lack of female-facing deities, and that felt odd. just felt odd because the gods are a reflection of the society, and half the society is female, yet the majority of the gods were male, and that's just a bit weird. So bringing that back is well worth doing. So I rewrote the entirety of the religion section. So if you go read Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4, 4th edition, that religion section is one of the bits that I wrote. And you'll see that end to end. And Rhya was brought back as a unique cult with her own history. And again, those hints and strong ties through to the Old Mother, the original religion of the Druids. The Druids who were, for all Warhammer seem to have moved away from them, still part of the setting because of the Jade Wizards. The Jade Wizards were the old Druidic families repurposed in a new way, and they weren't the only example of the old Druids that still existed in the Empire. There were still lots of old Druids living out in weird backwoods places, following the old faith and worshipping Rhya as the Old Mother, as a core central part of their faith. And this all got re-added back into the setting. Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 4 was all about trying to rebalance everything that had happened over the last 20, 30 years of Warhammer and effectively say, here's everything that used to be, let's just bring it all back together and drop it down into one simple book so that you understand everything for playing in the Empire. So Rhya was added back in. Now, through the course of the releases since then, Rhya's had a bit of extra details. She's had new spells, new miracles added, which are uniquely hers, rather than just adding bits of Talon, who is very much a different god, the god of the hunt. But later writers have come along again and started to merge them again. You'll find in, say, for example, Archives 3, there's mentions of Ashernos yet again. The idea that originally the concept of Tal and Rhya was a single concept. But I think I'm going to conclude my intro with a slightly different angle, and it goes back to the questions that we started with when we were doing the super chats at the beginning of the stream. And that is, are the elven gods human gods? And the answer to that is, in the setting, most of the early human gods that were classical are all the elven gods, copy-pasted. Because the people of Tilia and Estalia had the old elven ruins. They found the statues and the temples to the old elven gods, and they in turn worshipped them. They worshipped them in different ways. There was lots of misconceptions, things got wrong, but they got their Cain, they got their Isha through Rhya, they call it Ishea. You've got your Kurnos down there, you've got your equivalent of pretty much a good chunk of the elven gods, Hoeth instead of Rhya, but still the same gods. And most of those were ported up into the Empire. But the Empire also has its own versions of them up there. And Isha and Kurnos are two separate gods. Now, did humans then try to combine them at various points? Sure. And in fact, I think that makes sense. Did the cult of Tal go on a massive execution of other cults that were in a similar sphere to theirs as they went to war across the old world? Because the Telutans spread out from Talapai multiple times and raised other cults. As we discussed in the super chats at the beginning, one of those cults was the cult of Ahalt, now called Ahalt the Drinker, who is a horrible cult these days because all of her followers were slaughtered by the Talites completely, end to end. But that old fertility goddess came back again, because in Warhammer, you don't necessarily need followers or worshippers or even emotions or whatever. These are real entities sitting in the equivalent of the warp, the divine realms, if you will. And she came back and she was pissed. Similarly, Rhya in the real world god system is not subsumed by Tal. So for all Tal spreads out his cult and takes on aspects of Ryan worship in some respects, taking on those aspects has done nothing more than support the cult of Rhya. Cult of Rhya in the modern Warhammer world is a very real thing. Sometimes other goddesses are deemed to be her. In some cases, that will be the case. Rhya just worshipped under a different name. But other times, local fertility deities are entirely unique and discrete. And that's okay, because Warhammer has space for all of them. Particularly when you take a look at some of the core stories that Tal and Rhya are given. Because regardless of the great conflict between Tal and his people spreading across the old world, Tal and Rhya are often described as being married. And they have a lot of kids. I mean, a lot. And sometimes these kids are handmaidens. Dyrath, for example, the fertility goddess of the Reichland, is often described as a handmaiden of Rhya because she is her daughter. Manan is a son of Tal and Rhya inside the Empire pantheon. You'll find that there's loads of gods, so there is no need to say they are all just Rhya in disguise, because the setting itself already has places for them, and some writers have said that is the case, but other writers have said that she is not. These other versions of Rhya are nothing more than Rhya. So, to quickly sum, before we dive into it, we have ourselves a goddess that was created in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and stayed a goddess largely of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. She's both started very weak and then turned into almost a completely different cult until she was re-envisioned back to almost her original idea, the one that Graham wished he'd written all the way back in first edition. And we are left with a goddess who's been a part of humanity since the old ones, because she's the core goddess that sits at the heart of the druidic faith that used to center in Albion. If you want to know more about that, go watch our Albion stream, because we dive into that deep. That cult is spread outwards, and as it spread outwards, it begins to dilute as it meets other groups. One group holds that cult to its heart. That is the Belfari people. And they spread across the old world, but other peoples they meet sometimes merge Rhya with Tal, sometimes worship her discreetly, sometimes create new goddesses or gods like Shernos. There's lots of different tales in different parts of the Empire. And over the course of time, the cult of Rhya as an individual god is entirely squashed as the great tribes of humanity arrive in the right basin. This is the Umberigans of Sigmar. This is the Teutigans et al. Her cult is pushed down. It's largely a fertility cult, so it moves off towards the edges of society, but never dies. Some 2,000, 3,000 years later, the cult of Rhya is still alive and strong, and she is a goddess of fertility, life, sex, the fields, crops, growing. Indeed, many parts of the Empire believe that Rhya gifted the idea of crops directly to them as a divine gift. The last thing worth saying is down in the south, an entire tribe of humans believe that Rhya is in fact their starting point. So it's worth noting that Rhya, for all she was dampened and almost wiped out during the second edition and third, has had a massive resurgence in the fourth edition and is now a core component of the Empire and the old world as a whole. Indeed, as one last point is worth putting forward, in more than one place, many people believe that even the lady is nothing more than Rhya in disguise.
Because that's just what the lady needs, more disguises.
More disguises!
Just because he was kind of core to us even picking this up as a topic, I just want to pull up Victor's comment here that says, my fiance is playing a warrior priestess of Rhya, who's sick and tired of having to sit back and wait for tragedy to come to her communities, and instead took up a sword and donned armor. And she is now getting a temple built for Rhya in Midtime.
See, I think that is great. And I think that using the stories of individuals to form up new, not just orders, but new ways of expressing faith is worthwhile. I did something very similar with the Warrior Priest of Shalia in one of my games. And it was very much an imposition on the setting in that version of Warhammer that we were playing at that point, there were no warrior priestesses of Shalia at all. And she was very much the first. And that, I think, was a really nice way to, you look at a standard career, which is warrior priest, and then try to figure out ways that it can express for deities you might not know. In a similar fashion, I don't think knight is a natural fit for Rhya. And so I don't think we should have big knightly orders of Rhya, but I'm more than happy for an individual PC to go down that route, and for perhaps lots of individuals in the past who have been knights who swore to Rhya, but it wasn't great knightly orders, it was individuals and individual stories.
Yep, there's some ideas that I actually have cooking in my head that we'll discuss a little later, but we need to get caught up with Super Chat stuff.
Yeah.
Boom, here, Jonathan Scott. Could Chaos cults pull off opposing cults of Rhya? Yes.
Yes.
Chaos is a sinister little bastard. They're good at hiding. They're very good at it. So, yeah.
Yes. You'll often find one of the core ways that Chaos cults use to infiltrate is to pose as a different cult. Think of over in 40k with the Genestealer cults and their four-armed emperor. They're effectively taking the Imperial cult and replacing it with their Genestealer facing version. And the Chaos cults in the Warhammer world do pretty much the same idea, as do other cults. Don't just focus on the Chaos cults. It's super easy to just think of them, but there's a lot of prescribed cults in the Empire, gods that are not deemed to be legal to worship or to adhere to. So having those cults also posing with a a different front is worthwhile because it can make for interesting stories.
Yeah, there's that's actually a big thing for this, Jonathan, is that this is why I was so excited when the Kislev Golem got expanded for technically the old world, but for Warhammer 3, even more technically. And they came up with the idea of the Great Orthodoxy, with being this idea that it was laying these tracks down of, you could see they were building the idea of, the thought that Tsar Boris was trying to find a way to stop this from happening, to kind of codify the various cults so that they would have like a much more strict set of rules that they follow that would make it far more difficult for anyone to impersonate them. But as we see with the setting, that leads to its own problems and its own dangers that Boris maybe didn't foresee before his untimely death. Stephen, Earth Mother replaced by Skyfather. Elden Ring, Marika killed the evil sun and replaced him with a gold light tree for her monotheistic religion. So, wow. So, yeah. And this is a really, really popular trope. The whole idea of the Earth Mother and there being like conflicting forces that come in and, replace them or supplant them. It's a very, very, very popular myth in almost every culture that humanity has spawned up.
Yeah, and replacing and using that myth inside your fantasy games is also thus common. So yeah, Earth Mother replaced by Skyfather is common in almost all fantasy and real world histories. It's quite amusing.
Charles D. Key, what if the Empire was founded by tribes whose primary patrons were Rhya, Mor, or other non-war gods?
They were. I think this is something that a lot of people get wrong. Go check the Tome of Salvation and its introductory section, which is the first chapter. And it shows that the founding Empire tribes all had their own gods, and many of them weren't warlike deities. Mor was a part of that, believe it or not, although he wasn't known as Mor back then. Rhya was probably a part of that also because of the nature of the different tribes that settled. But Tal was, and Ulrich was, and later Sigmar too. All of the gods had their own reflections, and there was different versions for each tribe. So that's not a what if, this is what happened. You'll often find that different versions of Warhammer will present different gods as old gods. In the current version of Warhammer, they often drop Mor, which I think is stupid, from the old gods, because death is a core concept from the beginning. In the Tome of Salvation, though, they had the idea of the Quin Deus, the first 5 gods that were super important, which was Mor, under a different name, Manan, who the other was, Tal, Rhya, and whoever the last one is. It just Ulrich, of course, it's Ulrich.
Ulrich, yeah, Winter.
And they were directly related to each of the seasons and death. But that 5 often becomes 4 because people forget about Mor, particularly because Mor is a classical god, and the name Mor was imported from the south into the north of the Empire. So by the south, I mean the south of the old world into the north. But Charles C.K., it's not really a what if. This is kind of what happened, but different writers all take slightly different views on how it's handled.
Pormesia, let's say someone is infertile. Would a priest of Rhya see that individual as a cursed being or a problem to solve in order to expand Ryan beliefs?
All beliefs have got their own extremists. Extremists will come to different conclusions with the same problem. So I think both of those answers could be responded to in different ways according to the individual Ryan. If we just look at the core Ryan belief, though, this is a potential point of pity rather than curse, rather than anything else. Someone who can no longer bring life into the world. But equally, the Warhammer world is not like the real world. Infertility is actually relatively rare by comparison to the real world, because almost anything can be made fertile with Gyron, with that magic that floods through everything, with that magic that is a core component of Ryan rights as well. Without intending to do so, they are manipulating the magic that already exists in the real world with their divine miracles. Anything can be made fertile. And indeed, when Gyron goes wild, anything does and will become fertile. When the Chaos Gates are flooding through, everything can spawn the weirdest of creatures. Things can grow in you like cancers in the most unexpected ways. And yes, that includes men giving birth to babies in the most horrific way. Chaos is horrible. And when the magics go out of control, it's horrible. But loosely speaking on this one, infertility is, if you've got a Ryan around, probably not the problem that you might have elsewhere, unless there is a physical issue wrong with you that's beyond just simply my seed does not have potency, or alternatively, my womb does not drop eggs. Well, it does now because you've been blessed so that it does. Indeed, there's an entire blessing largely centered around that, as we discussed near the beginning of the stream.
Yeah, and one thing I would also add is that Ryans are not obsessed with the concept of like you need to be having lots and lots of children, like you need to be having 10 13 plus children. They're not. There's a joke I am tempted to make but will refrain from doing so, but they have a much more reasonable outlook than you might expect from the initial service, where there are Ryans who, because they tend to communities, there are Ryans who give advice on how to avoid having children. How to protect yourself from having unwanted children, because they care a lot more about quality of life as opposed to abundance of life.
Absolutely. Birth control is a core component of Ryan worship. Okay, how one controls one's fertility. Now, do they love children? Yes. Do they love fertile people who have lots of children? Yeah. But do they also respect the need that sometimes that can bring hardship? Yeah. Okay, because the crops need to also be tended. They need to be fertile. And if they're not, then it's all about control. They are a far more practical group, that's the cult of Rhya, than the extremists that you might get elsewhere, or indeed even in parts of the cult of Rhya. Because for all we say that, there are going to be extremists. There are going to be some who are like, fertility first, screw all the rest. Birth control bad, because we should always have those conflicting, weird views that sit on the periphery of belief, because some people believe strange, extreme things. And that includes within cults like Rhya and Shalia et al., ones where we normally think of them as relatively, let's put it in really horrible, bland terms, nice. And they absolutely aren't. And they make for great stories. Extremists are a core component of all the cults in Warhammer. Indeed, extremists are often the core problem of many of the main conflicts in Warhammer. So remembering that cults like this have their versions of extremists is a core component.
Yeah, often we'll focus on like the core, foundational aspects of the various cults, but they're always going to have extremists. They're always going to have outshoots. I mean, think of your, with Shalia, as Andy was talking about, the idea of the ones that think suffering is a core component of worship of Shalia, and that enduring suffering is an important aspect of life, which most reasonable people would say that's fucking stupid. But
there's plants you can chew upon that will give you pain relief. Not according to those Shalians, they're not. That is not true mercy.
Yeah. So never get too settled with thinking that these are like harmless and good guy, super easy, barely inconvenience groups. One of the things we'll talk about when we get through super chats and stuff is the various ways that Ryans, I think often when people hear about the concept of like a fertility goddess and goddess of nature and like crops and livestock and stuff like that, is that the goddess is inherently like non-violent or peaceful. Rhya is spooky. Rhya is actually really spooky without having to go down very deep at all. But we'll get into that in a little bit. Skylar Martin, Rhya pulling off a mask to reveal our god Kremlo. No.
Why would you do that, Skylar?
No, that's a reveal that the world never needs to have. No. Monkey Boys, are there any anti-fertility figures in Warhammer like the Whore of Babylon? Their legend has them target the pregnant.
So this is the sort of material that many writers feel deeply uncomfortable writing about. So you tend to find that it's avoided in most products. And they are sort of wrapped up in general terms. Like they'll say something along the lines of, and the cult of Sigmar will preach that chastity is blessed because it makes it less likely for the depredations of the dark gods to reach into your soul. Basically saying, sex might be bad because it might bring Slanesh and stuff. And they cover it with a vow of chastity. But in fact, that vow often makes things worse because abstinence begins the first steps towards obsession because of the thing you can't have. You're looking at it going, I can't have that. But your brain's thinking, I want it, I want it, I want it, I want it, particularly because it's a core function of life. We are made to procreate, and denying that core function can turn into an obsession, which can turn into just a big onslaught of Slaanesh at a later date. So you can see where the cult of Sigmar came from. But they generally don't bring out individual examples for why or how they project these arguments. So instead, they say these arguments exist without personifying them, without bringing individual figures into it. So the answer to this is, yes, there will be lots of individual stories that are used to do this. And equally, the Ryans will have the counter example. Lots of individual stories who will discuss fertility as a positive force. This is not the Empire, that is not a place where one cult has absolute dominance over all others. It's a place where Sigmar is dominant and his beliefs, at least as espoused by the cult, are dominant. But they are no way the only ones there, and there will be just as many counter figures as there are supporting figures to the anti-fertility stance.
All right, so we're caught up here. So now we can get into some of the nuance and various little things when it comes to Rhya. So one of the things that I think is worth exploring in particular, because this is a Warhammer setting overall, is when you're dealing with a goddess like Rhya, how do they express in the Warhammer version, by which I mean the idea of, picking up a hammer and smashing somebody's skull in, because at the end of the day, that is a core foundational property to what Warhammer is that everything at its core can be very inherently dangerous. Not in the sense that it's sinister, but one of the things that I find interesting about Rhya that's worth pointing out is that where Shalya is a goddess of mercy, Rhya isn't. Mercy is not a foundational tenet to her, and she is quite capable, much like nature itself or livestock, of being very deeply, deeply dangerous to those who do not appreciate or abuse the things that she values. One of the things that I find particularly interesting about her storytelling, especially as it got expanded on in later editions, because 4th edition, for anyone that cares, 4th edition roleplay really has been a wonderful expansion for Rhya of not only what was set down by Andy and friends for the core rulebook, but the later expansion, which was pretty fun for her in the Volume 3 Archives of the Empire. But the thing that I really encourage y'all to think about is thinking about how the various aspects of Rhya of a goddess that very much represents things that can appear harmless to the people that it's benefiting, such as domestication, summer, crops, birth, and all that, can actually be very, 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 very dangerous. One of the things that I find as the biggest launching point is children, in the sense that the Warhammer world is a dangerous place. It's dark, it's foreboding, it has a lot of grim and gritty nastiness going on. It's not quite the obnoxious, super over the topness of the 40k universe, in that it does have quite a bit of light going on in it as well. But Rhya is very much a protector of children. And often a story beat that you'll see is people that, especially when people are designing their own PCs, is the idea of children, PCs growing up in abusive scenarios or growing up poor and being abused by society at large. And what's interesting is Rhya is the biggest storytelling element of a goddess that has, to put it very bluntly, zero tolerance for it. Of the people that attack or abuse or exploit children for whatever their ends may be. And that could be something as overt as you have someone in an orphanage that is just violent and takes out their various angers on children, to people that predate on children, to people that exploit them. So that common idea of the farmer that you'd hear about in good old age America before the Dust Bowl, where people were having as many children as possible to basically just use them as employees that they didn't have to pay and would just feed them, but like the relationship there was quite negative. Rhya is a goddess that will punish you for this, and her punishments are fucking scary because ultimately she is a goddess of life. She is a goddess of renewal, but she is also a goddess that if you do not give back to her and make proper offerings to her, she takes what she wants from you. And you may...
Yeah, I mean, just as a small addition to that, this is a goddess who is often associated with summer, with life, when everything's at full bloom. And summer only exists because of what has been sown before. And if what has been sown before is not properly cared for, then summer fails, the crops fail, life fails. And that means that there is a whole host of steps that Rhya holds dear in terms of the build up towards the great bounty of summer. And that includes children, that includes the seeds and the crops and the fields, that includes everything that's heading towards the great bounty in the future. And when they're not in place, then it's going to be put in place through different means, and that might not be friendly.
Yeah, one of the things, actually, let me go ahead and grab this. So Cole actually asked this earlier, which is, was hoping that we could just elucidate a little further.
So just loosely to bring this one up, directly, no. Indirectly, yes. And by that I mean Graham Davis, as I mentioned in the intro, was a great lover of the classical pantheons and was attempting to reflect some of the classical pantheons, some of them directly and very, very obviously, particularly if you look at, say, Myrmidia, and the direct relations to, say, Athena, where Rhya does sound similar to Rhya. There'll be a reason for that because copy-paste. But indeed, she is more like Demeter. Graham was combining great broad pantheons into a small group of a small constellation, if you will, of deities. And it meant that there was combinations, and he was happy with that because he's creating a new version. This isn't something that's a reflection of real world religions, of real world gods. This is something that's new for just Warhammer. And their Earth Mother deity was not Rhya, nor was it Demeter. It was something far both more broad and also a little more specific. So the answer to this is the inspiration is clear, definite, and was in Graham's mind, but he was never intending for it to be a copy-paste.
Yeah,
at least that's loosely what he said to me. I don't want to put words in his mouth here because he's not here, but we have discussed the gods significantly because he and I had some disagreements concerning some of the gods, and we talked them all out when we were preparing for the Enemy Within, and it turned out we didn't have disagreements. It's just we were both arguing different points from different directions, and we actually thought exactly the same thing. So at the end of it, we were like, oh, well, that was worth it. Let's move on.
Yep. So there you go. But as I was talking about, one of the things that with Rhya that you would find in the setting, but once again, this isn't too explored on, that I actually think works well for Warhammer type scenarios, even from a battle game thing, is one of the situations where Rhya really would come into play, and this is actually reflected in one of the miracles that was added in Volume 3, known as Rhya's Rage, is the idea that Rhya is a protector of like guarding things that we often think of as like that harsh scenario, where if someone is defending a child, if someone is defending their home, if someone is defending their fields, if someone is defending that which needs protection under Rhya's domain, that is a situation where this goddess would offer strength to you, giving you that kind of, think of like the stories that we have in our world, right? Those the infamous adrenaline stories of the mothers that are like getting that burst of strength to lift a car off of their kid that's been pinned underneath it, or when someone is protecting a family member or against a home invader, and they have those Herculean bursts of strength and energy. In the Warhammer world, these would be expressions of Rhya. This isn't like, I actually really like the idea that it's not in like a situation where the beastmen are coming for you in your village, that in many times it wouldn't be Sigmar that's rising up to defend you necessarily, especially in the more rural communities. It's actually Rhya. It's not these great warrior gods that's going to be necessarily the core thing of.
I dispute that to a degree. Sigmar will always be there for that. Always. But I'd amend it with but there would be others too.
Yeah, okay, yeah, it's he's not your only source of strength.
Absolutely.
There we go.
Yeah, you've got to be careful that we don't take away one of Sigmar's core concepts, which is the defense of empire. And anything that is a threat to the empire, which includes your Beastman raid on a local community, is definitely something that Sigmar is interested in hitting in the head with a giant hammer. But equally, the attack upon that which is sacred to Rhya, or indeed to any of the other gods, just as a small aside, but to Rhya, is going to bring potential wrath of the gods in a variety of ways that some people might not expect for what appears to be, at least in the surface level, a goddess that is largely about being, fertile, about handling life. It's life stuff, isn't it? It's not about having a big scrap with, Bob the Beastman who's arrived this day to ruin everybody's day. But sometimes it absolutely will be that, because Rhya is an old goddess, an old hoary goddess from the past, which has got those strong ancient rites of fertility tied to her, many of which will be relatively bloody and much more base than most modern religions might realize. One of the reasons why fertility cults are often in most civilizations replaced with different gods later, and you can very easily have those ancient rites of fertility be a core component of your version of Rhya or the Earth Mother in your games, and those ancient, probably very bloody rites fit perfectly with this goddess, because she is not, as Sotek very accurately puts it, a goddess of civilization, a goddess of mercy. This is far more the classical god route, which is the more using your brain and getting past the wilds. We are gods of civilization. They're much more at one with the wild, with the cycle of life, with the passing of seasons. And these more atavistic parts of creation of life are a core component of what many of the cults that are associated with Rhya are engaged with. And it's one of the reasons why other cults can come in and say, down with this Ryan stuff, it's well wrong, particularly if you're looking at a very male-centric view, looking in at, say, blood rights of Rhya and how they work with the menstrual cycle and how they empower women in ways that the local men just don't like, which creates immediate interesting conflict, particularly when you look at what happened with the cult of Tal and how much it subsumed the cult of Rhya all over the place. They took over what they considered to be the weaker, most certainly weirder cult that often was involved with blood and cycle of seasons and stuff they just don't like, because it's all bloody and horrible in a way that they don't like. That's not stabbing, it's weird. And because of that, it appears that those cults have been destroyed, but they haven't, because they are feminine-led cults without temples. One of the core concepts of Rhya, as she has been repitched and rewritten, is that she doesn't have the great temples that all of the other cults have. Her temple is life. She doesn't need this great, big, open, hallowed area where the gods themselves manifest before the children and they pass on stories. Instead, these female-led communities might have circles of women who are passing on the secrets of what it is to be a woman, passing on the rights of womanhood, passing on what it means to be a child, to be an adolescent, to be a woman, to be a wife, to be a partner. All of these things are discussed and talked about in a far more root and branch method. It's more ground root. They don't have the big cults as we understand it with some of the others that are preaching what they believe is the right way of life. Instead, it's literally hand-to-mouth information being passed from one mother to one child, generation by generation by generation. In some respects, and for some aspects of the cult of Rhya, all women are priestesses. Every single last one of them is passing on what it is to be a woman, what it is to be fertile. And a core component of Ryan worship is centered on femininity, but not just femininity, and far beyond that. It's also worth noting that it's very easy to go, well, where's the male fertility in this? Tal. he's often depicted as having his, let's be in slightly euphemistic terms, his strong horns. The strong horns of Tal and the sheaf of wheat that is Rhya. Indeed, when we were writing the second edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay, I got called out for being too explicit with my language because I'm a grown adult and I don't really care if I'm talking about sex stuff like it's sex stuff, because that's adult. But they didn't want that language, so we use euphemisms. The horn of Tal, the sheaf of Rhya, indeed suggested by Games Workshop. They're like, we love everything, it's just we need more euphemistic language here. So we're not going to be talking about penises, we're going to be talking about the horns. We're not going to be talking about vaginas or vulvas. We're going to be talking about sheafs of wheat. And the male-female component of the cult in Tal and Rhya takes fertility on both sides, because one of the lost parts of Tal is he's also a god of fertility, a god of virility, a god of life that also applies in some respects to women. They cross over in multiple places. They do make a natural union, but that doesn't mean their two cults have to be combined. In some places, I think they should be, and in some places they would be. But I very much feel that they should be separate, discrete deities. So this feminine-led clergy, for want of a better description, is how much of the cult works, with some individuals within that feminine-led group, blessed by Rhya herself, possibly through one act of saving a child or through a particularly difficult birth or whatever it might be. They might just be blessed because they themselves are super fertile. Who says? There's lots of different routes you can take, but Rhya blesses individuals. And these individual priestesses, for want of a better description, are the ones who are capable of doing the blessings and the rituals. But this is not to say there's no holy books of Rhya. There are, but a lot of them are disseminated more academically. So they're gatherings of folk traditions rather than blessed books. And these gathering of folk traditions and old prayers are the holy books that would be sold, where in truth, the real holy book is the information that you receive from your mum. This is the prayer that you say when your monthly comes on, or when Haletha comes and blesses you each month. In the North, in Nordland, for example, the menstrual cycle, when you bleed each month, it's called Haletha's tears. Haletha's tears come out because you've not had a child this week. It's not seen as something to be sad about, though. The goddess weeps tears of both joy and sadness, the life that hasn't come, but also great joy that you are still fertile, alive, and capable of moving on. And the women folk often go out into the forest to explain this to their kids, because it's women's mysteries rather than the male mysteries. The male mysteries are often more focused around war and bloodshed and various other horrors. And often that girl over there and how hot she is, where the female mysteries are often dealing with the fact that they are going to go through trauma in their life in a variety of ways that no man will face, in the same way that most men go through a trauma that most women don't face. Female trauma of birth, female trauma of rape, female trauma of aggression, all of these things that are passed on from mother to daughter, from mother to daughter. And this is the cult of Rhya, as we understand it. It's not this great hallowed hall. It's not this massive network of temples with a single individual sitting at the top saying, I am the greatest priestess. Although there are multiple examples of exceedingly important priestesses all over the place. But this is also a complete contradiction to what came in, say, second and third edition, where all of the great halls of Tal and Rhya were a thing. And there was a leader of the Ryan aspect of the cult of Tal and Rhya who sat at the top of it all. And you can do both. There's no way of saying that one doesn't exist and the other doesn't exist, because the empire is so big and the old world is so big that in some places it gets organized because it has to. And it's stayed organized for maybe centuries. In other places, it's just the women's mysteries passed down from one generation to the next to the next. In another place, it's tied directly to the cult of Tal and Rhya as the pair of them working together, because they married Tal and Rhya. That doesn't mean they didn't have kids with other gods, because gods are going to god. And at some points, Tal will be viewed as feminine. At some points, Rhya will be viewed as male, because the empire's big and they've got lots of different stories. But broadly speaking, all of the various versions of the cult can absolutely be true within the Warhammer world without them invalidating any of the other parts.
All right, we're going to take a moment to get caught up on Super Chats and stuff. Ricky Chapman We remember helping a female giant who wanted to have kids but couldn't. So we helped her by taking her to a temple of Rhya. After some difficulty, she finally had kids, and as thanks, joined the church. Joined the church. One of the things that so this has 2 points. Giants are a lot more fun than I think most people realize in the Warhammer world. They're actually a lot more neutral in their disposition towards the various groups of Warhammer. Obviously, we tend to see them with like your orcs and goblins and things like that because they're just seen as these great destructive forces, because often they are deeply inebriated to deal with just the pain of their existence because they're really tragic figures. But you every once in a while can come across giants that are actually, if you can find a way to communicate with them, are perfectly reasonable. Though they are, they are aware of the power they wield in the scenario, is the polite way I'll put it. So you have to.
Yeah, we added, Ricky, this as almost this, but not quite this, as one of the adventure hooks in the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay starter set, where you basically find a giant baby. And what the fuck do you do with that? Giant baby! Huge giant baby, because you're not going to leave it there just to die, because it's a baby, but it's a big baby. So yeah, those aspects are super fun. I'm also going to bring up this comment from Tabal, because I think it's actually worth saying. This is almost getting a weird conversation between two men. Lindsay, we need you, and you are sort of right, but and by that I mean we are dealing with a lot of female facing parts of the Warhammer world, and it's always better to have women lead those conversations because it's about stuff that influence them directly. But we're talking about the overall cult here. But when we were writing, for example, parts for Rhya and the other feminine-led parts, it's why Lindsay was on team. It's very important that you have other voices who have a voice on this particular subject. My wife has led women networks of tens of thousands of people. She's very much into feminine-led projects. So she was also in a position where she could then reach out to other people and say, is what we're doing good? Have we managed to hit the nail on the head concerning all of this? So it was absolutely essential for us nailing down how we would build that, rather than doing what had happened first time round. And bless them, Graham was left to do the job entirely by himself because Games Workshop had a small team. But that is not the perfect environment to do it, because you do it that way, you get what you got for the original Warhammer, which was mostly men, because he was thinking about most of the male deities. He was thinking about how they could apply to Warhammer, and he didn't really, because it's not that he was ignorant, he just didn't think of the broader implication. He now looks back at it and going, oh God, I made so many mistakes. Because you live and learn and you make mistakes. And he wished that he'd done more with Rhya, for example. So I agree with you wholeheartedly, while simultaneously, we did do this in the past, so it's not like it wasn't done.
Yep. Plus, we've had way weirder conversations. I feel like on the show, so it's like whatever. Laughing God had a character concept for a beastman born of a priestess of Rhya who wants to return the lost children beastmen to the fold. Nice. Became a prophet of Rhya, causing a lot of religious issues.
See, I love things like this because anything that brings conflict to the established norm, and when you look at it at face value, is the right thing to do, is kind of awesome as a story. The idea here being that beastmen don't necessarily need to be evil. And here we have an example of someone showing how that could be the case. And that could make for a brilliant story, because as far as the Empire is concerned, beastmen are evil. And tackling that is super fun.
One of the things I actually like about this a lot, Laughing God, is I've thought a lot, because it's come up in, like, ever since we started Lorebeards. We've chatted on and off about the idea of there being non-evil beastmen and what that would look like, whether it be like a tall light expression or whatever. And when I really think about it, thanks to your super chat causing me to take a kind of a brief moment, I actually do think Rhya, in my opinion, would maybe be the most appropriate way to approach it, because specifically when you think about the beastmen of the old world are, for the most part, they are domesticated animals in their expression of that. They're goat-headed and bull-headed, and they're not often wild animals. They're domesticated beasts that have intermelded with man and stuff, which is Rhya's purview, not Tall's. Of that, the herd animals, the livestock animals, are the creatures that fall under her domains of influence. of, you know, when you have the situation of the wild beasts of Tall.
There's crossover.
There's crossover,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
it's more her focus. Compared to like the wilds of Tall. Rhya is often
Definitely.
pitched in the books as sort of taking her husband's nature and making it more I don't want to say calming it, because it's not really what it is, but allowing humanity to work with it. Rhya, one of the things that I wish that was kind of more explored with her is that she, of all the gods, in my opinion, she is by far the biggest stepping stone, the great bridge between the gods of, quote, civilization and the gods of, quote, the wilds. Where
See, I kind of disagree there. Because she is the old god of the wilds and fertile and cyclic natures. What happened with the Warhammer world is that she, like all the other gods, and they tend to forget it, broadened that sphere as time went on. Domestication, for example, is generally said to have come from Rhaya's learning. She divine influence directly into the tribes. But there's lots of things. The core concept of hunting and using that to support your community comes from Tal generally. And that's also a core component of civilization and being able to come in. All of the old gods have got aspects of civilization, how to get the bounty of the sea out of it. So they all act as bridges. And I don't think Rhya is more of a bridge than the others. So my disagreement's not deep. My disagreement is more just a bit broader. All the old gods are much broader than many of the writers realize. And Rhya is one that's super easy to focus on because so many people haven't written anything about her. So you end up sort of almost falling into saying, and she's the one, but she's kind of not. They sort of all are. All of the gods gave things to mortal men that allowed them to civilize rather than do what the Beastmen did, which is stay at one with nature. Having said that, though, Tal and Rhya are perfect deities for Beastmen. Literally perfect. Yes. They are perfect. And the fact that that's never been explored is interesting because you can take two primary views. One, no one's just thought of it and they just haven't done it. Or two, literally the Chaos Gods have got claim over them, and that makes it super hard for these perfect deities to come forward. But I'm going to deeply contradict that as a position, because one of the core concepts of Warhammer is that you have heretics. And a Beastman heretic will be one that falls to Tal or falls to Rhya. The heretics should be a core component of all groups, and that includes chaos-facing groups. They are going to have their own heretics. Say, for example, the Norskins, who all worship Karnith, Khorne, or some equivalent in the north, and one who falls to Ulrich and becomes effectively a heretic amongst their group. The counter stories to the classic cults in the south, in the Empire, for example, where they fall to chaos because they fall to one form of chaotic influence or another. The same thing happens elsewhere as other gods gain influence into the chaotic mass that is those other groups. And Tal and Rhya, I think, is a perfect infiltrator into the Children of Chaos, the Beastmen, because both of them are just perfect. But I can see antipathy there that might stop it never happening. For example, take a look at the Beastmen and how they're viewed by the High Elves, who are effectively led by Tal and Rhya under a different guise. And we all know how much they hate the Beastmen as a perversion of everything that comes. But that doesn't mean that Beastmen couldn't be converted elsewhere. And I definitely think it could make for a really interesting story.
Yeah, I think that actually might be a way that you could tell a story that would be super fun, of showing a way that maybe humanity is able to do something that the elves theoretically couldn't. That the elves are so far removed from the Beastmen that they can't see them as anything other than barbaric, savage monsters. But with humanity is only a hop, skip, and a leap away from, and not even that, to be frank, from the Beastmen. Of that, a human can directly give birth to a Beastman. It happens a lot. And that idea being that, once again, the Ryans would kind of be on the front lines of that. If you're having births and dealing with the fact that the child comes out as a Beastman or a mutant, for the Ryans, what I find really interesting is they don't have a stricture of like, oh, well, if a Beastman child's born, kill the child. That's not a part of what Orion would necessarily do. Now, they might do that. You could argue that they would do that because they might see that as.
But when you look at, I mean, if you look at the stories, most child births that are beastmen are not killed and they're given to the forest. Why? Why do people do this when they know that these beastmen are almost certain to return? Is it simply the heart wrench of the parents incapable of killing their own child? If it was that and they were in an isolated community, they just fucking raise the child themselves and hide it. But they don't. There is an imperative to hide it from, say, Sigmarites, who definitely would kill it. But there also seems to be some imperative from elsewhere, and it seems very likely a core component of Ryan belief is life to a degree is sacred. And when life comes in a form you don't expect, it should be raised by others, which means immediately there should be some form of communication between Beastman and Ryan. And now we've got a reason for potentially going to extremists. Okay, extremists who believe Beastmen should be a core component of human society and some really weird stuff. These make great stories.
Yeah,
and these are stories that work well at tables. I
am just realizing how there's like a massive, heavy, untold story right here that should be told, and it's bothering me now. Like how massive the hole is.
So I actually not to go into the things that I didn't do, because I hate doing this because I didn't do them. But there was going to be a conversation about this. It had already been had behind the scenes, where the equivalent of what was going to be the Realms of Divinity book, the equivalent to the Tome of Salvation for 4th edition, it was going to have an entire section on life and what it means to Rhya. And bringing up lots of different stories. And it was going to answer this very question, which is one of the reasons why I brought it up, which is, why do so many communities give the Beastmen over? It's because it's a part of Ryan belief they should do. And most women hold the stories of Rhya passed down to them from their mothers. So most of them believe this is the correct thing to do, for good or ill, because the cult of Rhya is arguably the biggest one in the Empire. Because all women, to some degree, are passing on the secrets of Rhya from one generation to the next. And they are perceived to be the secrets of Rhya under one name or another. If you want to discuss who's got the biggest cult in the Empire, by the way we were going to write it at that point, it was probably going to be Rhya, which is why it was so important that Rhya got re-established as a core deity inside the core book, so that we could already set up what was going to be written later. And what was going to be written later was basically the entirety of the Empire is one gigantic cult, as is most of the old world, because they are passing on the secrets. They are a polytheistic people. Very, very few people in the greater scheme of things only worship a single deity. No one just sits there going, Sigmar's all I need, Sigmar's all I need. That's an extremist. The vast majority of them are passing on the secrets of all the gods. And then individual priests are there for when they don't know what to do to appease an individual god. They go to that priest who says, this is how you deal with it. And they go, ah! But when it comes to women's matters, all the women knew how to deal with it. And if anything, the closest they had to a priesthood was the wandering midwives. People who were passing on the secrets of women mysteries from one community to the next and passing over core important details on what it was to experience life through that, where others were being passed through with farming rites and rituals involved with that. There's like loads of stuff. But sadly, none of that came to pass. But I do think that it's one potential route. If you're out there at the moment figuring out how to use Beastmen in your game in a different way, it's one potential route for arguably making a mess, because the Ryans have a belief that is extremely damaging. It's dangerous. And that belief is that you don't kill these births. And that is a bad belief for many communities, because the people that benefit from this, the Beastmen, are not good people, at least as they stand as a base stereotype inside the Empire. They are quite literally worshipping chaos gods. They are often worshipping something terrible, and they are probably going to come back and maybe even destroy this community at a later date. And those sort of conflicts are good. Not everybody has good beliefs. There's no need to make everyone perfect, every belief to be the right belief. Some things are just not right, but it could be because once, when the Ryans were, well, the old mother cult was working way back in the past, they were effectively at peace with the Beastmen. And that peace was broken with the arrival of the tribes as they arrived into the Reich Basin and imported a bunch of new gods with very different beliefs. And war broke out amongst the groups. There's lots of stories you could use, but it's going to be down to you to build them.
Yeah, because one of the things I find super interesting that a lot of people don't consider is when we talk about like the old Belthani tribes, which were very, very, very Rhya-centric, like ridiculously Rhya-centric. One of the things that's super interesting is that the lore always glosses over is that it talks about how the Belthani were like this super peaceful people that just get absolutely massacred by the arrival of the Tuchigans and the Toluchans and all these other folks. Yeah,
all the other tribes.
But they lived in what should have been a beastman hellhole at that point, because the elves and the dwarves have pulled back. The Belthani are out in the wilds around all of like the great circles and the stone circles and everything. They should have, if they were so peaceful and unable to defend themselves, the beastmen should have massacred and eaten them for breakfast, but they didn't.
Yeah,
and there's a story there.
Yeah, and that was a story I was going to pick up through rumor and ancient myth and all the rest inside the religious book to effectively make sense of some of the weirder stuff that exists in Warhammer lore that makes zero sense if you look at it for more than 30 seconds. And one of those were going to be how beastmen were treated by various things. I'd also like to bring up this small comment from Kadane. Are all people blessed by Rhya female? No, they're not. Nor are all priests blessed by Shalia female, nor are all priests blessed by Ulrich male. But the Ryan cult is a dominantly female group in the same way that the Tal cult is a dominantly male group. But that doesn't mean that they are all of one gender or another. There's lots of different ways of expressing this, not only because it's a spectrum and gender is a weird thing anyway, but because our relationship with fertility is going to be different according to our own individual backgrounds and what Rhya thinks is important within the individual. For example, male fertility is generally represented in the Empire with Tal, with his great striding horns, and use whatever metaphor you prefer. Rhya generally is female, but that in no way is a limiter, because many of the farmers, the domesticators, are very closely associated with Rhya, but they're forming a different type of Ryan worship, or Ryan foot forward, pardon me, than say, for example, the women's mystery side of it all. And you often find that women mystery cults are related to an individual subgroup, for example, Dairath, or any of the other Ryan-facing goddesses.
Yeah, Rhya, who's totally not Rig. Yeah.
Goddess Rig. And they're often used in replace of Rhya. So Rhya gets the broad picture, including all forms of fertility, and the individual women's mystery parts are usually given a fresh name. So down in, what's the one for Reichland? It just suddenly left my head.
Hyacinth.
No, that's the halflings.
Hold on. I can find it.
Is north. Dairath. No, it's Dairath. It's Dairath. Dairath and Reichland.
Yeah, it is Dairath.
Okay.
Yeah,
it's Dairath and Reichland. So Dairath is the women's mystery goddess of the Reichland, but it's basically Rhya, just under a different name. So Rhya is not wholly female, but many of the inner female mystery cults kind of are, and hopefully that answers that.
Yeah, I think so. And if you play The Enemy Within, you will encounter a male priest of Rhya very early in part 2. So have fun with that.
It shouldn't have been, God damn it, should have been a druid.
Yeah, well, that's not what he got pinned down as. Damn it. You're right. He should have been a druid, but feel free to either make him into a druid or lean him even heavier into the Rhya thing and play around with that.
Yeah, because the druids of the Earth Mother, they span equally across both genders, and they are ultimately worshipping and celebrating the Earth Goddess, Rhya, and they are equally across both genders.
Jack Flanagan asks, how often do the gods of order manifest physical changes in their most devout followers? I play with the concept in my own campaign where the Chaos Guards aren't the only ones who bestow physical gifts to the champions. It happens more often than the game likes to remember.
Yeah, this is something that you have to be really careful with. Mutations are not physical gifts that are the same as divine blessed stuff. Okay, so let's loosely cover this one. The gods of, let's call them order, but they're not the gods. The gods, and a lot of them are deeply disordered. Many of them are prescribed. Many of them are pure evil. They're not chaos gods. They're just gods. I would never, ever use gods of order for this alone.
Calling Manan a god of order.
It's not a good idea. Manan is often a god of pure destruction. Similarly, if you take gods like Borthbach or you take gods like Cain, these are bad gods, and there's a lot of them. And if you constantly use their blessings, then sometimes you go more and more closer to and akin with the deities. You become more and more like them. And there were divine marks added to the second edition of the game, which basically did that. This was something that the war game already sort of had. If you take, for example, how the Storm of Chaos book presented the cult of Ulrich and presented our Ulrich in that, he had literal claws and fangs that he had grown because of his close association with Ulrich. He was becoming more and more Ulrican, so to speak. And these divine marks were a core component of how the second edition in the Tome of Salvation marked these miracles and these blessings being used repeatedly. And if you rolled a particular roll, there was a chance you pick up a mark. And they're not all positive. About 50% of them were nasty, 50% of them were a benefit. You could sometimes lose statistics. You could sometimes get weaker, more emaciated, or bigger and stronger, depending on the deity at hand. More, for example, very closely associated with death. You could go literally more associated. Your face becomes more sunken, wan. Your hair might even fall out. That's pretty awful. Where with Sigmar, you're sort of getting bigger and bulkier and perhaps less agile. Okay, as you're becoming more and more like the man god. So, loosely speaking, yes, this happens, but it is not seen and does not get recognized as a mutation. And I mean that quite literally. There are some spells that allow you to detect mutation. That is, you detect a corruption of the body, the mind, the soul that has effectively come about often because of Warpstone or because of Dar and getting too close to black magic and how it represents, or the Chaos Gods themselves. Often nothing to do with the Chaos Gods, though. It just happens. If you go to the top of the world, for example, that place is a mess of magic. People are mutating all over the place, and they believe these are blessings of the Chaos Gods. They almost certainly are not in most cases. Most of them just happen because of where they happen to be, and they believe they're blessings. The gods of order, as you put it, the other gods, if you gain any of the marks of those gods and someone comes up to you and goes, "Do you have a mutation?" with a I cast, "Do you have a mutation?" spell, the answer will be a definite no. Because it's not a corruption. It's instead a harmonization with the deity at hand. So there's something really very different happening there. And it's almost the same as what happens with the Chaos Gods. Harmonizing with a mutated mess of a Chaos God means you often go a bit gribbly or get a horror face or whatever else it might be. So there are similarities, but they are definitely not the same.
Yeah, there's we could do an entire stream on the nature of mutation versus like divine blessings and stuff, because there is a notable difference there. Many mutations are from a divine perspective purely mundane. It's just an expression of what magic does to physical matter. Which it'll do the same thing to your body as it will to like a tree, to like the ground or water or anything else. It mutates and alters in very bizarre ways that normally reality would not allow for. But that should not be confused with divine blessings. Though agreed. For chaos, they often heavily get conflated.
Yeah, they do. 100%.
And granted, there is something to say about that. The Chaos Gods like to grotesquely warp and fuck with reality in ways that other gods are significantly more hesitant to do, which often results in this. Parisma, for example, priests of Mor don't panic. They mustn't. They cannot be seen to. They're quiet, generally speaking, because that would be a generalization. Some will. Do priests of Rhya tend to have very distinct traits?
I mean, yes and no. In that many of their traits are often feminine traits, and the traits of an extreme of femininity, which means they're often women facing and just fit in with all the women. So there's a yes, because many of them are often perceived as happy, summer, gregarious women. And when a male priest starts portraying those, they may be seen in a different light. Being happy with sex is a thing and not being anything that's particularly taboo, hardly a trait though, that's more of a conversation point. But also having intellect and being aware that some communities just can't have those conversations whilst they themselves are off doing whatever they want to do. I mean, the answer to this one is no and yes, and your typification there, more must not panic and cannot be seen to, they're quiet. That's also a lie. That's also not really true. Whilst many of them become stoic and grim, okay, that's not because they have to. That's just because that's what more is. And it's not they can't be seen to do these particular things. Many Morians, go read some of the books, are literally pulling up their robes and running like bastards, completely out of their head in fear and panic. And they're not seen to be less Morian, they're just seen to be human. And I don't think that's necessarily the case, but loosely, yes and no.
Yeah. The only thing I would add is that if you were like reading like a novel and you had an author that was like, oh, I'm going to put a Ryan character in here, I'm going to try and give them very stereotypical Ryan attributes. You're going to often be dealing with, like what Andy said, is someone that displays a nature that you might describe as bountiful with life, of being someone that's full of summer.
Happy, summer, bright, hot is very common indeed. The core god of the Menegoths who came in from the south was Sul, the sun. But they also believe that they are the children of Rhya, the hot join between the sun and Rhya, and they believe that they are the literal mortal children of them, and they would become the Solanders who would one day be wiped out. So the children of the gods is a common concept across the empire anyway, but hot, summery, bright, vivacious, and alive, which stands in stark contrast to the modern Wizenland character, which is bland, flat, their voices are monotone. They stand in deep contrast to what used to be the course spiritual component of the Menegoth, which in turn is often seen as a Ryan one. I want to pull up two quick ones just to go very quickly through them as well. Just great to see you, first-time listener. Hiya, Busnan. What happened to first edition Druids? They're still there. They did not all become hedge wizards. In fact, hedge wizardry has nothing to do with Druidism, although some people conflate them. Priests of Rhya, no, although some of them have become that. Some of them have become Jade Wizards. Throughout the second edition of the game, I brought them back in for the Tome of Salvation game because Druids have been forgotten, even though they were still in the battle game with the Jade Wizards, and the Druids outside of the Jade Wizards still mentioned. So they got brought back into the game in the second edition. They're mentioned in third, and they're also in the fourth edition of the game. It's just they've never had a full set of rules that are really worth talking about in most places. But they do have a career. They're good to go.
Yeah, go check out our Albion stream as well. We've done, and just like Andy said, if you actually pick up Volumes of the Empire Archive 3, granted, it'll give a slightly different version of them to what you might hear on Lorebeards, but they are their own completely separate category from the hedge wizards and the Ryans and everything.
Yeah, and just as a small one there, it's the mother. Rhya is the mother. It's really easy. Rhya is the mother. And yes, the Mother Maiden Crone is still a core component of that. It manifests in different ways across the Empire. Anyway,
even if Games Workshop goofed the fuck out of that in the end times, but that's a discussion for another day.
Lilith, who is the maiden, who suddenly becomes not.
Yeah.
Man. Sorry for interrupting that flow.
No, you're all good. Fuck, Mary, kill Rhya Valea. I would not want to kill any of
and
them.
Isha are the same thing, so you're basically going to remove one of them there.
Yeah,
they're basically the same thing.
Yeah, so like, but for me personally, I'd probably go with fuck Rhya, kill Aisha, marry Valea. Would be my. That probably would.
It's almost like saying the same. All three at different times of the day. In winter, one, in summer, another.
There you go. Watchdog 3079 GW. But then Sigmar. Yeah. Everyone else. Really? Just okay.
Yeah, I'll admit I was a little disappointed with the most recent Old World bit from the roleplay game where it says this is a time before Sigmar has become more important than all the other gods. And I was like, yeah, that's not true. It's just not true.
Yeah,
it's just not true. He never becomes that in the Warhammer world.
Yeah, the battle game has the GW core studio writers have an unhealthy obsession with Sigmar.
No, that was the roleplay side. That was the roleplay side. That was the roleplay side. Totally.
That's silly.
It was an interesting line to take, I thought, because that was the roleplay side in discussing what was going on in Talagad, which is going to be the core component of the old world roleplay game as a setting, in the same way that the original setting.
Oh yeah, I haven't had a chance to read through the old world.
And I read it, and I was like, well, I mean, they're right at this point. In the established history, Sigmar is actually illegal to worship in Talagad, but I'm quite convinced they're going to overwrite that entirely when they do the old world, and they're just going to say Sigmar's everywhere, yeah, because they seem to love their Sigmar.
Boo-hiss. Boo-hiss, I say.
Before that, Sigmar was 100% illegal in Talabine.
Stroy Boy, Random Beastman, join me, my kid, in Rhya's embrace. Hey, that big brass Minotaur is running us really fast. He must love Rhya. Yeah, one of the things that would, I think, make this story, like, if you wanted to have a really cool roleplay campaign, in my opinion, having having your PCs introduced to like a babe, like a baby that's clearly blessed by Ryan, like a Ryan priest is like, this baby has to survive because this could be the redemption of this ancient pact that used to exist between humanity and the Beastmen. The opposition you would face from both sides would be horrifying. Yeah. Horrifying. Because the Dark Gods would be hell-bent on destroying that child. Because imagine, the thing that I would love so much about this is imagine if your PCs realized that in their care, they had the literal redemption of the Beastmen as a species. And think about what hells to the end of the earth the Dark Gods would unleash to make goddamn sure that did not come to pass.
Yeah, that's great.
Like, that would make for a fucking awesome, really stressful campaign. Because the Empire would not be helpful at all in the slightest. Nor would like the elves or the dwarfs. Like, you would really be on your own. And it'd be spicy. Theo Barona, if the gate was to be closed, talking about the gates at the north and south of the world, would the gods disappear from the world? Would priests still be able to bring miracles?
No and yes. The gods do not work through the gates. We know this because the gods existed before the gates came. The gods were communicating with the world in a variety of ways, and the elven gods were definitely with them on Ulthuan. We have multiple descriptions of the gods literally being on the world. So that's before the gates. They didn't come through the gates. They manifested in their own ways. So the gates are not a necessary component for that to be the case.
Yeah, that being said, it's possible that, you know, everything would change, and that the gods might express very differently, but yeah, they would still exist.
Hey, Theo Barona, here's a potentially completely different way of viewing it. What if Warhammer World has been so soaked full with Gyron for so long that it has become an absolutely necessary component of procreation? You can't procreate without it. It is fertility in the Warhammer world. You shut the gates. There's no longer any Gyron anymore. So if you shut the gates, you wipe out all populations in the world. That's one way to look at it. You don't just need to look at the divine aspect. Think about what the magic is doing for the world.
I found this comment funny. It's not technically true. He is capable of yes or no answers. They're just rare.
Hey, Mr. Mike, you know I do love to say both.
Plus, hey, to be fair, this show would be really boring if we just said yes or no.
True fact.
Yeah, it would be boring. Roderick Hamilton, woo! Can't wait to catch this one on Spotify. Lore love, lads. To you as well.
Thanks, Roderick. You kick ass.
Yeah, man, it'll be up there in the coming weeks or so. All right, so we've discussed a lot of different things. One of the things that I think could be fun to discuss with Rhya for a good bit little here is that there is, of course, just like with all gods, there is sinister aspects to Rhya as well, without going into like corruption of like, oh, chaos is taken and stuff, but things that are genuinely dark about the god. One of the things that's big with Rhya is the concept of giving back. so that Rhya bestows you with bounty and life that takes place in the forms of you have childbirth, and you have crops, and your livestock are giving a healthy birth, and yada yada yada. But there is a running line through the stories about how it is considered really, really key to give back to Rhya, and that can take expression in different ways. Oftentimes, it's a returning of life to the soil or the goddess as she gave unto you. And like you can see this in more extreme versions. I mean, if you think of like how the Wood Elves view giving back to Althel Lauren, right, is a similar process of like massacring armies of beastmen, allowing their blood and corpses to feed the forest. That there are extremists among the Ryans that will take things to such extent of literally killing and offering people back to the goddess. But often it's less extreme than that. Often it's like giving like a percentage of the harvest and like burning crops and offering, or giving back. It could be, putting your, slicing your hands or whatever and making an offering of blood to the fields or to certain aspects. But it can lead to an interesting amount of situations in the setting of you can explore stories where communities become so distant or so quote unquote civilized, they're so focused on city living that they don't give back these proper offerings, and how that can lead to extreme issues down the road, where you have the idea that while Rhya is a giver of life and stuff, once again, she is not some merciful, boundless entity who will give and give and give and give and expect nothing in return. She has expectations.
I'd say it's almost less that she's giving, and it's more that you're doing what you should be doing. And if you don't, then you won't have a large enough bounty of harvest, which means when you do the offerings you're supposed to give, you can't, and Rhya will be pissed. So, for example, it's not so much all life is there because Rhya instead deeply associates with this life and this great fertility that you are supposed to be sowing. And if you don't sow it, you won't have enough of a bounty to give her the necessary sacrifices at the end. Which means you're in trouble because Rhya, like any of the elder deities, one of the original Quindeus, as we mentioned from the Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2nd edition terminology, one of the original 5 ancient gods of the Empire, she is a force of nature. She is summer. She is deeply entrenched into the cycle of seasons. And if you don't do the right thing during her time, your bounty will be wiped out. She is not this all-loving, all-giving deity. She is a part of nature. And nature, like all the nature gods, whether that's Manan or Ulrich or Rhya or Tal, they are ferocious entities with deep passions. And those deep passions sometimes manifest in ways you don't expect. Now, if we look over at the broader Ryan stories and moving over to Isha stories as well, often she is weeping or crying because of some great loss that she's had. Elven stories speak of Isha and her no longer being allowed to directly communicate with her children the life that she helped bring about. And that is nothing more than another expression of her deep passions. And Rhya is known for her passions, both her passions for others, be they man, woman, god, or otherwise, but also her passions for what she holds important, which is the great focus point of life. She is life. And if you don't attend to that life, her fury will come in. There's a reason we have Wrath of the God rules. Those Wrath of the God rules will apply. Your priestesses and priests of Rhya are out there to basically show you how not to piss off Rhya. And how not to piss off Rhya and attract her great wrath is to be fertile, to tend the crops, to look after your animals properly, to ensure that life is tended properly. So come summer, it blooms. So as we move into summer, the spring into the summer, everything is blooming, everything is working well, and everybody can sigh a big, heavy, yeah, we're going to survive the winter when Ulrich comes. We're going to survive because we have tended to Rhya's bounty. If you screw that up, Rhya will take away what you have, meaning that your meager amounts become terribly small amounts because you pissed off the goddess of fertility.
Yeah, which can show up in some pretty horrifying ways. I mean, famine is the really obvious one, but like births become more complicated. Summer isn't as glorious as you expect it to be. And it can express in a lot of really just super. I honestly think Rhya's probably one of the most terrifying gods to piss off. I mean, think about how like back in you have the old myths about how when Demeter, when her daughter got taken down to Hades, Persephone, and how Demeter was like, all right, fuck everybody, and how much the world was like, oh, this is the apocalypse. Of that, she was so much more terrifying than most of the other gods, to the point where you had like Zeus and everyone begging her to do something. And Rhya would be in a very, very similar position of, instead of it being the typical large Warhammer threat of your scenario of like great armies coming down to smite you or the corruptions of chaos mutations, it's just that life doesn't rebound, is that the cycle pauses. If you think about like the expression of, they talk about how Rhya said to bring summer from Ulrich, that it's this great passing off. But imagine if she just didn't pick up the rally point.
I'd just like to pick up a small question there, because we've said it several times, and if you haven't caught it, Jack, I think it's worth making sure that we do catch this. These are not the 5 original gods of the Empire. Okay, so different versions of the lore have got different stories for the most important deities in the early Empire. Now, most scholars through first, second, and edition sort of suggested, this is in-world scholars, that the Queen Deus, the 5 gods, rose to prominence. There were hundreds of gods, and they're generally, if we go to, say, for example, the Tale of Salvation, they go to its introduction, probably about page 9-ish, somewhere around there, they'll have a bit about saying concerning the first gods. And in the first gods, each of the tribes that arrived in the right basin had their own god. But 5 gods came to rise amongst all of the tribes. So regardless of what tribe they came in with, 5 gods came to rise above them all. And by above, I mean all of the tribes realized that those gods were important. Other gods might have just been left with a single tribe. And those universally, not so much worshipped, but often feared gods were Tal and Rhya, we know them very well, Mor, Ulrich, and then finally, I'm going to forget the last one, Manaan, of course, of the sea. Manaan. Okay, so any community that referenced the sea would immediately obviously fear Manaan. And the life, whether that is sea-bound or life-bound for Tal, we've got life itself as the core component of fertility with Rhya, and death, of course, coming through with Mor. More recent writers often don't like associating Mor with the original 5, because Mor is a classical deity as well. And the classical deity, which is a later group of gods, are all the gods that got imported from Tilia, Estalia, et al., got imported up into the Empire. The classical deities are like Verena, Mor, Cain. These are the gods that came later and are generally associated with some form of civilization in one fashion or another. And this group of gods come in, and Mor's one of them too. But they tend to not realize that the Queen Deus, Mor, death, was a deity already in the Empire at this time. And when Mor got imported in, the god got renamed across the Empire to the Morian equivalent, because all of the records were recorded by the cult of Verena. And the cult of Verena referred to the god of death as Mor, because that's what it did, because they were a classical deity from the south. So the Queen Deus, we've explained, and Mor's name change has been changed, but you'll find that some writers forget about the 5 and they miss Mor entirely from the original group of gods that rose into prominence amongst all the tribes. So hopefully that clarifies it all for you, and also shows why Rhya was so important in those early formation points. She was entirely worshipped by the peoples who were in the area before the arrival of the tribes. She was the core deity, and then when all the tribes came in with their own gods, her worship disseminated through all of the tribes underneath, generally speaking, the guise of Rhya, although over the course of the centuries, many of the individual groups would change that name to some local deity equivalent. Hey!
Nicely done.
Quite a lot there. Well, hopefully that explains it all for you. But you're going to find that different writers do have different views in this. The original Queen Deus are often not to the ancient gods of just 4. But death is so core to human experience that forgetting death is almost foolish. Life and death, Rhya and Mor, are directly linked.
Charles C.K. asks, could Rhya be connected with the born from the earth type mythos? Either people growing out of soil or Elder Scrolls dude has sex with a hill thing.
Yes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, absolutely could. Funny enough, I remember us specifically talking about this in regard back during I don't remember what stream it was. It might have been, it was something to do with druids or life magic or something, or like magic getting out of control or something. But yeah, absolutely. Remember what Andy said earlier of that everything can become fertile in the Warhammer world under the right circumstances. Literally everything.
Yeah, it's also worth noting, just because I don't want to lose this, because we've not really discussed any of the myths with any great depth. Rhya is deemed to be the mother of the world. Let's get that super clear. Most old world myths put Tal and Rhya at the center of the creation myth. This is separate to how the elves do it, where they place Azurin, the divine creator of all, as the core creator of the universe as we understand it. And they often use Isha and Kurnos, our Tal and Rhya equivalents, to be responsible for the animals and the population of the world. And the elves were particularly beloved to Isha. Where in Empire myths, it tends to be there's no divine creator sitting above it all, generally speaking. Instead, they say that Tal and Rhya birthed the world. Now, you could argue the elves say the same, because the world is the creation of Kurnos and Isha, and the universe is the creator of Azurin. Pardon me, was created by Azurin. So you could argue they're saying the same thing, but it's weak. The Tome of Salvation's got a lovely bit that directly references, and I'm bringing it up because I wrote this original bit, but they fucked the formatting completely. There's a bit at the beginning of the Tome of Salvation, which I'm literally just pulled up in front of me now, because I've been talking about the Tome of Salvation several times, so I thought I'd bring it up a bit. And it speaks about the beginning of the world, and it says, and it began, Rhya the beautiful. So the very first words of the beginning of the world is, as it began. Now, the formatting was meant to put the next line sitting on the other side, effectively equal. It wasn't meant to be the next line was underneath. It was meant to be equal, formatted, justified, right. And the next word section, we'll assume it's played equal, is Tal the powerful rose up. So Rhya the beautiful rises up, Tal the powerful rises up. And then again, it was meant to be sitting underneath each other with equal place, because Tal and Rhya were given equal preeminence when it came to the creation. Blossom broad, hot with life. That's Rhya. And on the Tal, it said it was meant to be spread of horn. And we all know what that means, given what I said earlier on in the stream. Firm of will. Now, you can describe that however you want. Then underneath, it was meant to be beneath both of them. Then they did create all natural things. So all natural things were then built by Tal and Rhya, which is a core component of how they come about. In the old world myth, if you will, the old world and all the people in it are pretty much built by Tal and Rhya, showing how important they are to the core beliefs of the Empire. They have life because of Tal and Rhya, who fucked them into existence. And that, I think, is something that's super easy to forget when we're sitting there going, Sigmar's the most important. No. The lady's the most important. No. They are divine protectors of those individual realms in the old world, but Tal and Rhya are still the creators, and they are still a core component of all people's belief, pretty much across the old world. And it has been handed down, pretty much mother to child, father to child, since almost the beginning of the old world's existence, which in the greater scheme of things isn't that old. It's only a few thousand years old. And their beliefs are relatively consistent throughout that. Rhya's extreme importance to the old world cannot be overstated. Neither can Tal's. There's a reason the two of them sit together as divine creators. And it's something that if you're thinking about your version of the old world and how you want to present it to your players, try to remember that all of your players at the back of their heads will be, I only exist because of these gods.
John T. Scarecrow asked a question of, is there a tradition of life magic practice associated with Rhya that would be older than the colleges of magic?
Druidism. Yes.
There you go.
Yes,
yep.
Druidism.
We also have Jonathan Cott that says, could there be a Ryan Knightly order that evolves from the male partners of priestesses of Rhya who armed themselves to protect them from the servants of other gods or various things?
I mean, why would be the answer when other gods are fulfilling this role? And this is a very monotheistic view. Ryans are also Morians, are also Sigmarites, in that just because you happen to know the mysteries of Rhya doesn't mean that you don't respect or fear the other gods as well. If it came to someone who's a pure priestess of just Rhya and absolutely understood Rhya, that doesn't mean that she only does Ryan things. She's fully aware that Ulrich is the king of winter. And she's going to respect that, because that is what winter is. So this feels somewhat monotheistic in approach. She would be more likely to marry a white wolf than she would be to try and make a Ryan knight in this particular instance. There are already components that answer this question out there. But I'm now going to contradict myself completely and say, yeah, it's a great idea. It's a great idea. And there's nothing saying you shouldn't do that, because individual places in the Empire will have lots of weird individual beliefs. And whilst top tier, I'd say, no, don't be silly. You don't need to do that. Individually, for the scope of a single story, I think it makes a lot of sense.
Yeah, I could actually see there being like some kind of ancient incident that happened where like there was a community on like the hair's breadth of survival, and there was some great evil that came to them, and they, someone, in this case, a husband of a priestess of Rhya, like laid down his life protecting her, and that led to the establishment of a group of protectors that's in that local community. And it's evolved over thousands of years, perhaps into something like a knightly order. There could be a fun story there.
Yeah, totally. There's loads of fun stories to have with this. But I would always, whenever I'm making a choice like this, try to remember that we are dealing with a polytheistic society. And if you're trying to plug a hole that you perceive being there, be sure it actually is a hole and that something else doesn't already plug that. And you're blind to it because you're just purely thinking of, say, Ryans or Ulrichans or Sigmarites. It is that there is polytheism very much front and center in everything that happens in the old world.
Lupuson says, I feel the big thing is that this wouldn't be big enough to be a full knightly order. Not all knightly orders are gigantic.
Yeah,
some are very
some of them are just like a handful of knights, like 5 or 6 or 7 who have sworn for one particular purpose, and that would work quite well for that.
Yeah. Senchmeister, okay. Does faith survive in the slaves of the Druchi? I would say it excels.
Yeah.
Because it's all they have.
You also have to remember that the Druchi are... They're not necessarily the best slave masters for all they try. They don't necessarily understand all the species they're dealing with. They don't have time because they don't care. So this sort of thing would happen, and there'd be slave uprisings, all of whom are calling down their individual gods. And sometimes there'd even be blessed servants amongst them. And the Dark Elves will just kill them, hunt them down, do whatever they do. They kind of don't care. So does it survive? Yes. Is it wiped out through generational slavery in some places? Yes. Does it come back again with the whispering of some old gods whispering to some of the slaves who are down there? Absolutely. Have new gods come out of this weirdness? Yes. There's all sorts of great tales. One of the biggest issues with the Druchi isn't what would happen, is that no one's written any of it, because as a whole, it's a very icky subject that many writers just don't like, and Games Workshop often deals with relatively lightly, in that they'll say, yes, they hold slaves, they do stuff, but they don't go into the nitty-gritty of what that means. What would actually happen in the slave pens? What's it like living there? How awful are the Dark Elves? And the answer is really awful. How superior do they feel they are over their slaves? And how would faith manifest and re-manifest? And how would darker cults also form up amongst these slave pens? Because many would. It would be a horrible place for a variety of reasons, but it will have its own cultures, its own gods, its own weirdness going on. So all of it would survive, not just would Rhya survive in there. There'd be so much more than that alone.
Yeah, the big question wouldn't be if it survives, because it would be how does it adapt? And like, but like, man, you think about, because it's a permanent lifelong situation that you're probably in outside of very rare circumstances. So you're gonna have to live, and people are still having kids, and people are still needing to eat and doing all these other things.
Gods are real.
Yeah.
An easily forgot point. It doesn't matter what the individuals in the slave pens think or feel, because sometimes the gods are going to reach out and tell them what the world is actually like. Divine revelation is a real thing in the Warhammer world. They can get information that they should have zero access to. Ulrich can empower people with the ability to fight when they themselves have had no training. There's all sorts of weird stuff that can happen in these instances. And the slaves, the Dark Elves, know it and don't care. That's the big one. How little they care. You go, but surely the Dark Elves would stop this and try to stop it. No. They have so little regard for their slaves. They're pathetic gods, and the pathetic things that they bring to the fore. If it all turns into a slave rebellion, that's just a good excuse for a slaughter, as far as many of the Dark Elves are concerned, to effectively show all the other slaves what they shouldn't be doing. And it gives them a whole bunch of fresh sacrifices to appease one of their gods. So yeah, it's a horrible thing.
Let's see. Oh, yeah. John T. Sears says the history of how aspects of many religions survived through slavery in America is actually really interesting.
Yeah.
I imagine that being enslaved by elves would result in similar adaptations. Yep.
I agree, John T. Scarecrow, but I would add one detail that some people might not like me saying. So I'm going to say, if you're religious, this might not be the sort of thing you want to hear. I'm really marking this one up because I'm not a religious person. So I'm going to come at this from my individual angle. You might take a hot disagreement on this, and that's fine. We can all debate these things out. And that's one of the reasons I don't like discussing real life stuff much, and it's why I didn't bring it up. But if you're of the position that religion and all of the religions are largely man-made, then yes, they adapt and change in lots of interesting and fascinating ways. If you believe God is a real entity, then God is going to come to these people regardless. And their core beliefs are going to realign to the truth, because that is a fundamental truth of all creation. But that's kind of not what happens. Instead, religions adapt, because from my perspective, I believe they're mostly man-made. Well, entirely man-made in truth. And that's different in the Warhammer world. The gods are objectively real. Powerful spirits are objectively real, which means divine revelation inside these slave camps can be many times more useful or pointed or directed than, for example, a bunch of people desperately clinging on to their older beliefs in the hope that they can then escape, do something else with them or something similar. So there's a lot here that could be discussed, but I think it's slightly beyond the Ryan discussion.
Yeah, I agree. Tio Borona asks, did Rhya give birth to gods or half gods? If yes, anyone notable? If not, why?
Yes.
Both.
Yes. Manan, for example, is Rya's kid. Dyrath is probably Rya's kid. Indeed, all of the various names for Rhya that you will find in books and probably online are probably her kids, not her. And what is being referred to as Ryan worship under another name is probably actually just another god who has similarities close to an attachment with Rhya. The only one that you could say absolutely certainly isn't that is Ashernos. Ashernos is a combination of Tal and Rhya, so it's probably not Tal and Rhya's kid, but very, very possibly is as well.
Could be, yeah.
Ashernos very much could just be Rya's kid, possibly with a different name. Loosely speaking, they are described, Theo, as having had multiple children and also children with other gods. Rhya and Manan are indeed even said to possibly have had children too. Manan arguably has had more kids than almost any other god, which stands in interesting stark comparison to the goddess of life and fertility. Different tales will say different things, and different writers have got their own preferences and also don't know what had been written by others because may not have read it. So the half gods and gods, there's a huge list, but no one's bothered writing it because the pantheon of Warhammer is horrendously composed, very badly put together, and nobody ever properly codified it. When we did the Tome of Salvation, I requested to codify it, and there was a big discussion behind the scenes, and the eventual response was, let's not this time. So we didn't. And we didn't.
Let's just not.
We made and it was let's just because we were going to be adding back a lot of things that many people thought had been wiped out of Warhammer, like Rhya. We were discussing Rhya in deep. There were some people who said that Shalia shouldn't even be added, which I found horrendous, and shouldn't be mentioned. And we were going to be going to town with all of these things. So they thought, no, let's just keep it simple. And then later on, if we do more, we can codify the Pantheon properly. Never happened in second edition. We were going to write an Empire Encyclopedia for second edition that codified it. That didn't happen then either. For fourth edition, I was going to codify it for the religion book, but I resigned before that happened. So we never had this all properly codified. But at some point, someone probably will.
Yeah, I will note for when it comes to like half gods, so like your sense of like divine mortals or divine parentage mortals. We did talk about earlier that one of the tribes of Sigmar, the Metagoths, they genuinely full on believe that they are like direct descendants of Rhya and the sun god. And not in the sense of like, not in like some abstract sense, but like in a very, very literal, specific sense of that they have an ancestor who was just a man or a woman that was born of the gods.
And rather interestingly, because their entire land was named after their own god, Solend. The main river passing through the air, the River Sol, is named after the god that they worship, Sul. And if you go by the writing that I was intending to add for second edition, Sul was, because we weren't allowed to mention Solkin, Sul was Solkin. It's that simple. That's who Sul was. So Solkin was one of the original founding deities of the Empire, according to second edition. Later on, Solkin gets brought back in multiple places in fourth edition, but we weren't allowed to mention Solkin during second edition. So we had to basically couch our version of Solkin as Sul, S-O-L. It's the same first three letters, but it had an umlaut over the O just to make sure that no copyright claims were made, because at that point, Games Workshop didn't own the copyrights for Solkin. And they kind of still don't. They still don't.
Yeah, well, I guess they just gave up and were like, whatever, we gave up.
Used it. So I'm not sure if they still don't, but I'm pretty convinced that they didn't make Solkin, because Solkin is nothing more than a direct rip in and of itself from not Conan, from what's his face, Solomon Kane, as I recall. Not Solomon Kane. It doesn't matter. That you know what I'm talking about if you're out there. But yeah, everything's a direct lift in Warhammer in its early times.
Yeah, I will say that, Teal, to my knowledge, unfortunately, I don't think we know the name of the supposed, like, firstborn child of the gods. It's just kind of like an abstract myth. So that's a story that has not been pinned, or a myth that hasn't been put to pin yet, and should, because that'd be nice.
Yeah, 100%. It'd be super fun. And you'll probably find that there are similar tales across all of the great tribes as to divine origins, because every tribe loves to claim that they're the bestest. So you'll probably find the Bretonii have got some sort of lady-based claim that possibly she gave birth to their tribe, and that could very easily just be a Ryan translation. You probably got claims from the Teutigans claiming that they are the sons of Ulrich. Indeed, the sons of Ulrich very much exist, divine children of Ulrich and shapeshifters. So they've got that myth already encoded. If you go over to, say, Hochland, their original deity Lupus probably has similar divine origin tales. We go over to the Lutins, they had Tal. They almost certainly believe that they are the mortal descendants of Tal. Don't think this is a unique thing. Most of the tribes somewhere will have loose origin theories in those areas, because everyone wants to look like they're the most special. And what better way of being special than claiming that the gods made you?
Yeah. Saw a little thing here. Morgan Crescent. One difference I would like to ask is, Sigmar is very much a god of the Empire. What is Rhya's worship like outside of the Empire? Is it where there's humanity, there's Rhya? Essentially, yes. So we know. You want to go first? Or you want me to go first?
You go. You go.
No, you're all good. So, like, if you look at like the fourth edition book, it flat out discusses what Rhya is viewed as, like in Talea Nostalgia, for instance, where she goes by a different name. And she's really well liked there because she actually has an interesting. I was going to bring this up, but you brought it up, so I'll do it now. Of that, she actually has an interesting form of antagonism or conflict with the Great Horned Rat, where the Great Horned Rat is a despoiler and a god of ruination and devouring and overconsumption, and Rhya stands heavily opposed to that and is a protector of grain and is a repellent of rats and teaching their communities how to deal with the disease and the pestilence and the horrors that he brings. So she is a prominent goddess in a lot of parts of Talea Nostalgia that deal with significant Skaven threats. She still has a major cult in Bretonia. Her and the lady don't conflict. You might think they do, but they don't actually. Yeah. They actually don't. She, of course, is a very, very prominent peasant god, but the lords and nobles and stuff who are not idiots also make sure to give her proper offerings and acknowledgement.
I'm going to add a little bit here, but just to make sure it's nice and clear. Rhya, you make offerings to Rhya to ensure the bounty of your crops. You're making offerings to the lady to protect them. They're very different things. Very different things. The lady and the knights that stand over them are protecting you from the depredations outside. Rhya, if you don't make the correct offerings to, won't let you even have the crops in the first place. She's a far more original form of goddess than the lady, who's much more of a patron of keeping the lands of Bretonia safe.
Yeah. That being said, one of the stories that I hope will get explored at some point in the roleplay game, or because it would make for an interesting discussion, is you do have this aspect of like Rhya is a goddess that you would expect to see expressed in some more form literally anywhere where there is life, to the point that like Rig, who is believed by some to be a handmaiden or very associated with Rhya, is over in Lustria, and you have aspects of Rhya like kicking up all over the world. But this would cause really interesting conflicts with cultures that don't have gods in a classical sense, like Grand Cathay, where the dragons have like heavily suppressed that, even though that probably would have been a thing in their ancient culture. And there's a story with what the situation is there and has it survived in secret among like certain groups. Because that also causes a fun conflict with the ancestor worship that Cathay is allowed to have. Of like maybe Rhya is reinterpreted as simply like an original ancestor to be allowed within the dragon's framework, which could make for a really interesting story.
Yeah, 100%. This question in many respects can be, are they the same gods? It's the classic Warhammer question. And the answer is, if you look between the lines, always yes. And then a writer will come along and say, actually, no. So there isn't a clean answer for this. For example, we know that the classical gods of the old world come from the elf gods, in that the classical civilizations, those that spoke the words of classical, they spoke the language classical, pardon me, often the people of what are now known as Tilia, over into the Border Princes and over into Estalia. They inhabited the ruins of the elves. They saw the various runes there. They found access to the gods that were being worshipped there, and they named them according to what they learned. And they sometimes took the names directly, they sometimes got mistranslations, they sometimes got a weird view, but ultimately the classical gods are based off the elven gods. They are not unique deities. They just aren't. They just worship the same gods under different names, and then exported that north into the empire, meaning that the classical gods are effectively just the elven gods under a different name, meaning that if you follow that, then the elf gods and the human gods shouldn't be called elf gods or human gods. They should simply be called gods. That's it. They're just gods. It's as simple as that. And gods are a universal constant across the Warhammer world. They're all there doing stuff at various points. And the answer to this one would be Rhyan worship outside the Empire would be like Rhyan worship anywhere else, but through the lens of the local communities and the local cultures and how they perceive it and way they learned their own individual myths from. That then leads to a far broader conversation where you go, well, are the Nehekaran gods the same? Are other gods that we find mentioned elsewhere, gnomish gods or whatever, are they also the same? And it's one large debate that can be held, and different people who write for the setting all have their own opinions. And that means that the writing often reflects different opinions as well, meaning that as you, as a reader and a consumer, are deciding what you want to be the case, are left to basically make it up for yourself. Because you'll find that some parts, take for example the end times, they make very clear differentiations between the elf gods and where they come from and the Nehekaran gods. They make them quite different entities. But equally, other writings say they're the same. It's up to you what you do with it.
Yep. Phil, how hard is it to deal with, okay, this is just out of nowhere. How hard is it to deal with the Games Workshop head office? How do they insist on pushing certain contents and material written by third parties?
I found it very easy. I found it marvelous collaboration would probably be the best way of putting it. In that you've got ideas that you want to bring to the table because you're a writer and you're creative and you want to bring in cool new stuff, inevitably. And Games Workshop are the controllers of this, what can and can't be added. And they have opinions. But Games Workshop is not a monolith. It's made up of lots of individuals. And each one of these individuals, when they're responsible for telling you what you can or can't do, will have their own opinions too, just like individual writers do, and what they think is real and what isn't. Which means that dealing with Games Workshop isn't about dealing with Games Workshop and all of its lore. It's about dealing with whomever the individual is on the other side. And if that individual believes, just to take our previous argument, that all gods are the same across the Warhammer world, then that's what you can write. If that individual believes that's not the case, then you can't write that. You've got to write something different. So as long as you accept that you're not writing stuff for your own games, that you're not writing stuff for anyone other than the customers and what Games Workshop wants it to be, it's a brilliant relationship because they tell you what you can do and you do it. And away you go. But if you find yourself in competition with Games Workshop, as in, I think it should be this, and they go, yeah, no, and you don't move, then it becomes a ridiculously difficult conversation because then you're having to say, well, I think you're wrong about your thing that you own. And you know what? They might be, because the individual concerned might not have read the other sources. They might be, and put it in deep, heavy quotation marks here, wrong, but they're not, because they are the representative of the IP. And some writers forget that. So that being the case, as long as you accept that they are the ones that decide what is or isn't so, they are the best partners in the world because they are hobbyists, they are gamers, and they are excited about the setting just like you are. So whenever you bring something cool or new to the table, they get excited about it as well. It's not just you going, oh, I'm writing a cool thing. It's them going, oh, this is a cool thing that's coming in. So it's a really good relationship. And sometimes they throw extra ideas in because they're like, you've made all this cool. Have you considered this? And you're like, no, I didn't. Great. And away you go. So broadly speaking, Games Workshop are the best partners in the world because they are passionate about their hobby in the same way that you are. And as long as you remember that they are the ones that say yes or no to everything, it never goes wrong. I found it a perfect relationship. I am aware there are those out there who find it very difficult, but that's their position, not mine.
Yeah, and it'll also depend on like the medium you're probably making as well, where there are some notorious stories about people who make the critical error, which I would advise if you ever find yourself in this position not to do, of making a bunch of stuff and then going to GW being like, look at all this cool stuff I made, can I use it? And GW says, no. Don't do that. I have met people who have done that, and it's not good for anyone involved. Make sure to go to them with ideas first, get approval, then make it.
Absolutely. I mean, it's a process. It's an approval process, and they're the ones who always have the last call. But some people don't do it that way, and they end up in trouble because they create something that does not match what Games Workshop wants, or because they weren't necessarily maintaining a dialogue. They said, can I do X? Games Workshop said yes. Then half a year later, they come in with X and they're like, yeah, we've moved. We now want Y. So along the way, they should have been communicating at all times, saying, we've just finished this bit, we finished that bit, is this still cool? To which they'll say, yes, yes, yes. And then one day they'll say, actually, no, now we want to go in this direction. And you go, great, glad you said that. And you can make the amendments before you bring in the final piece, rather than finding yourself in a very strange position where you've created something that they say no to, and then you have to weep long, long days of tears. I never want to be in that place if I'm working. You always want to be in a position where you are fostering communication and great ideas and hopefully marvelous books at the end of it.
Red aiming laser appears on Andy's forehead. Working with GW is great. I mean, to be fair, I don't think there are many people that shit on GW as hard as we do.
Yeah, we do.
Yeah, on Lorebeards, we disagree vehemently with a lot of decisions GW has made. And I will always be the first to say that, like, they do stupid shit all the time. But at the end of the day, they own it. And just like, and so it's a box that we have to work within. It's a system that we have to be aware of and we have to navigate in order to talk about the thing we want to talk about, because they own it.
Yeah.
And it sucks sometimes, but that's just the nature of the beast.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not working for them or as a license a partner with them, so I can have my own voice. My voice is, in terms of working with them, they're marvelous partners. Do I think that every book they've written is good? No. Do I think some of the choices that the certain books have made are good? No. I don't, and that's okay. We're allowed to have different opinions. There's nothing wrong with that. Would I have, in the creation of some editors or developers, done the same thing that some others did? Again, no. And we'll say that here in Lorebeards. When we disagree with the thing, we'll happily say, we don't think that was the best choice. We wish they'd gone in another direction. Often you'll find there's no great overarching plan, as many people seem to attribute to Games Workshop. They're not just sitting there trying to be the cackling, mustache-twirling lore holders. Instead, what fans might describe as a mistake of the lore is a mistake. And Games Workshop didn't realize they were doing it. And they just go, well, that's what it is now. You'll find there's a reason that you'll often find quotations coming from Games Workshop that says something along the lines of, there is no canon, or everything is canon, or whatever. That's just to make their lives easier. Whatever the newest thing is what it is. And that's it. Because that's all they really need for their lore. And Rhya is one of the things that a lot of people expected to suffer from this, because Rhya vanished from the setting through the course of the first edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay into Warhammer Fantasy Battle 4 and 5. Literally vanished, which is why it was not a surprise to see when she came back into the setting, to see her cult just wrapped up into Tal's cult, because Tal had been mentioned multiple times in the setting for Warhammer, but hadn't been mentioned pretty much, well, Rhya hadn't been mentioned at all, meaning that the two of them got conflated. But later on, they got separated again. And that's cool.
I just want to pull this comment up because it's a really fucking cool comment.
Like
what if you bring, a vampire lord or vampire lady obsessed with the idea of having non-blood-kissed children, so just regular kiddos, desperately dumps veneration of every kind they can at Rhya, blood, harvest offerings, maybe grows mad about it. That would be a kick-ass story.
Yeah, it would be as well, particularly because they, as vampires, are the opposite of what Rhya holds as important. They are anathema in many respects. So this is an act of desperation from someone that, and the vampire hand almost certainly knows that Rhya will never, ever respond to this. But can something be done? And the desperation that lies at the heart of that means that, yeah, very possibly. I think this is great. I think it's a lovely story idea. I think it could make for some heartbreaking horror. It would be good fun. That is a good one, and a good use of Rhya, and a good use of the vampire lore as well.
Yep. Mr. Mike says, everything is canon, not everything is true. The bane of my fellow Horus Heresy and 40K bros. Yeah, I remember when they said that specifically in regards to people criticizing certain aspects of like the Horus Heresy and 40K. Of that, so, like, oh, well, the stories are technically in universe, so therefore they might not be true, even though it's written in a god voice, so you wouldn't know that.
Yeah. I got called out by the 40K crowd at one point, like really hard. Not long after I left from doing the production job. I was in a stream somewhere, possibly on Lorebeards. I can't remember which stream it was exactly. And I said something along the lines of this. When I was doing my writing, there was a very clear line that I received from on high, and that was that every single novel should be disregarded. All of them that came from Black Library. None of them were considered to be canon for the core setting. The only thing that was canon was the army books that had been released for Warhammer 8th edition at this time. Everything else was a negotiation. It might be true. It might not be true. And it had to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis, so I should assume that they're all false as a starting point, and then use any of those details if they made sense when tied in with the 8th edition of Warhammer. So a relatively clean line. The battle game has precedence. The books mean nothing to it, effectively. The Horus Heresy crowd did not like the implication of that for their novels. In fact, it went wild over on Reddit, where they were like, writer says that all the novels should be ignored and aren't canon. How can they not be canon? They're what makes the game. If it wasn't for those, there'd be no 30K. They are all canon. And they went off on one. And I was like, yeah, not only is this a different setting, but you really don't quite grasp how unimportant canon is, because now we've got the old world out. The 8th edition books are no longer canon. They are now a separate game as the old world comes in and starts rewriting everything again with their new books that are now the core canon for the setting. And these books are overwriting things in a way that most people don't realize because they don't know the history that's already been established in Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay and Warhammer for the last 30 odd years. So when they come in and they say something about magic or how wizards are accepted or what the bloodlines are in the various places, they don't care if they're overwriting because they're making a new game. They're using the setting for their purpose. But by the gods are they rewriting everything over in the old world. But that is what it is now. That's the new canon. And that's what everyone will be writing towards. So when the old world roleplay game comes out, it's not going to be worrying about everything that was ever written for Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. It's going to be worrying about what's written for the old world and what they can write to support that and make it make sense. And whether that uses any of the other books as a source, that's really down to an individual negotiation. And that's always going to be the case. So yeah, I got into a lot of trouble for that. Super fun.
Yeah, I can tell you that you've told that story on Lorebeards, but that didn't happen on Lorebeards.
Oh, there we go. I couldn't remember if that happened in Lorebeards. It was a long time ago now.
Yeah, Victor made a comment earlier that I was going to grab out, and I just remembered, and I don't know if I'm going to be able to find it. But yeah, it's...
Oh, heck, look at the time.
I know, we're about to wrap up here.
I feel like we barely covered Rhya here. How do I sum this?
That'll be up to you to figure out in a second.
But
yeah, one of the things, and it's actually quite pertinent to Rhya discussion, is that at the end of the day, the reason I love Lorebeard so much is because me and Andy try our absolute damnedest to take everything that's ever been written about a particular topic and try and give ideas for how it can all work and how it can all be one cohesive story. That is not the way GW works at all in the slightest ever. And is often a really hard pill for a lot of people to swallow because we approach it as consumers, which means that we have a very, very different relationship where to us, a lot of people, the lore is all that matters to them. And that's great and awesome. Like, I'm one of those people. I think the lore should be the most important thing, and it should be the thing that drives every decision. But for GW, they care about every decision is formed by how do we sell the most little plastic toy men and make money. And that informs every decision.
Not constrain their creatives because a decade's worth of lore is deeply constraining if you want to make up something new and cool. We would not have demigryphs if people were not willing to create new. We would not have had the Hurricaneum. We would not have had a whole bunch of new stuff. Was that?
So this was in regards to earlier. Talagod as well. Worshippers are all but outlawed, which implies that it's not outlawed.
It's not outlawed.
but it's very disliked.
Yeah, that's a slight rewrite, and rewrites like that are going to happen again and again. Okay, now we're at the end of the stream, which I didn't actually expect we were almost at. So I have a couple of things to say to round this off. Rhya is an absolutely marvelous Warhammer Fantasy roleplay deity, a core deity that has been worshipped in its core setting, the old world, from the very beginning. From the point when the Druids first came out from the Mists of Albion and spread across the old world with the tribes of humanity that would eventually become the early Belthani and whatever other peoples were there. A goddess that when all the tribes of Sigmar arrived in the area, and they weren't the tribes of Sigmar then, we're talking 1,000 years worth of migration into the area, a goddess that would spread through all of those tribes and be a core part of, not their worship per se, because they don't worship the gods all the time. That's a bit of a mistake. They fear them. And she is an old form, fear this goddess. If you don't give the correct offerings, you're in trouble. The bounty of your harvest will not come to place if you do not take Rhya into your lives and do things that make Rhya happy. Make the correct sacrifices. And many of the Ryan occult practices are tied directly through to blood and through to an awful lot of feminine-leaning aspects of life. This goddess becomes the core central point of old Druidism into the newer forms of Druidism that we get in later versions of the lore through the 4th edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay. We have a period during Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 2 where the goddess almost vanished into Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay 3. We might have lost Rhya forever because a lot of things during the 2nd edition of Warhammer Fantasy Roleplay were dropped. But Rhya survived. She's the great surviving goddess because no matter what you do, the aspects that she brings of fertility, of femininity, of the core discussion that she offers concerning what it is to be human can't be pushed aside. So the second a writer comes along and tries to create this broader pantheon, they always return to Rhya as a core component of it, meaning that even when the entirety of the pantheon is focused on one thing only, which is war, which is all that was needed for Warhammer, the fantasy battle game, when we're sitting behind the scenes and looking at the overall building of their world building, she is a core component of it. Right from early versions where Graham wished he'd written more, right up to the more recent versions where the goddess is still being conflated with things that are perhaps best left with Tal, things like hunting. That's best left with Tal. We don't need to have Rhya having that as well, because already she has an enormous sphere where, if we look at it, her cult is probably the largest in the old world, but it's a silent cult, one without great temples, one without great gatherings every week where they mill around and tell stories of what Rhya did. This is a cult that is word of mouth, with people passing on prayers and blessings and little rhymes that you say under certain circumstances to ensure that that goddess does not visit you, or does, according to your needs and your wants. So Rhya is, for those of you out there playing with the old world, a goddess that you should all have sitting almost forefront in your mind when it comes to how does your character work? Because I'll tell you one thing, there are only a few basic drives that we have as humans, and one of them is directly associated with Rhya. So the core component of being a character is directly associated with one of the goddesses. So you should consider how that influences your character. And writers out there, when they're thinking about what they can do with her, do you always have at the back of their head that Rhya is arguably more important than almost any other deity in the Warhammer world? I mean, hey, we're all going to die, so Mor's just as important. And hey, life and virility is also important, so that's Tal. And hey, protecting the Empire is important if you're in the Empire, so Sigmar is important. Yes, to all of that. But there is a universal constant that Rhya should always be bringing back to the table. Possibly only more, maybe Tal, is as almost intrinsic to the experience of not just human, but life, because she is, after all, the goddess of life. That being the case, never let Rhya be forgotten and separate her as her own goddess. Don't give her a cult that's just Tal's. God damn it. I will argue that line forever, and I'm glad that we did argue that line for fourth.
Feather Freaks asks, how would Rhya feel about a couple that prayed to her for years to have a child, and then they do and the baby ends up being a mutant? Is it her fault?
Yeah, that's going to be a personal choice as to how they arrive at their conclusions. I mean, did Rhya have any involvement in the slightest? They were making offerings and they were doing everything that should hopefully attract Rhya. They've been turned down for so long. Then they get the mutant. Oh, that's going to hurt. But it's going to be down to what they think. I mean, if they think this is a blessing from Rhya and it comes out as a curse, then they might blame Rhya. They might blame someone else for the curse of Rhya's gift. It's really down to the individual story and the individuals at hand.
Yeah, this would be a beautiful foundation point for a complicated story, or creating someone that either hates the cult of Rhya and like is trying to go against it because they took such personal offense and they blame her for it, even though, yeah, there's a lot you could do with that. In the interest of time, I'll say that's a great question. You should explore it.
Yeah, agreed.
Ricky Chapman, we like the idea that changes the lore are caused by demons of Zinj messing with the strings of fate.
Yeah, and you're just dealing with different individual potential worlds rather than Storm of Chaos never happened, but it did. So yeah, it's just a multiverse.
Yep,
Lots of different versions of Warhammer. That'll do it.
Grabbing a couple little quick things right here. Morton Crest on a secondary note series. Thank you. I love all the daily life and small folk of settings. This gives you a lot to do with Rhya. She is one of the big ones for that. She's excellent.
She absolutely is. And she's one of those lovely hidden goddesses that people kind of don't see doing all the stuff they're doing, because most of their interactions are stuff that doesn't get highlighted in war games or often even roleplay games. I mean, sometimes Rhya might be brought up when we're dealing with a succession crisis or the desire to have a particular child in a particular situation. That's high politics stuff, and Rhya would be central to that. But the vast majority of politics doesn't involve Rhya. The vast majority of, particularly if you look at politics in other lands, Bretonia, Rhya is like as far away from your average noble lifestyle as matters. But for the peasants super important, because what they're doing, working the fields, living their lives, it's all wrapped up in Ryan's stuff. But as long as they make the right prayers, they do the right things, there's very little actual stuff that hits your games, but it influences all their thoughts. And that's something that I think is worth highlighting from this stream. Even if it's not necessarily something you're going to hear influencing the stream, it should definitely, this stream, influencing the games that you're playing. And that's because I'm streaming my game just now. Influencing the games you're playing, it should definitely be behind your thoughts when you're thinking about your characters.
Yep. And then last one we'll grab real quick because I saw this throughout the stream. Just want to grab it real quick. Some more has asked, Andy, do you have any thoughts on Warhammer Korea having a name? And do you think it's a place Cathay allies with to repel attacks from East Chaos Tribes, making ships to attack coast of Cathay?
So I really love adding more diversity to the various cultures of Warhammer. One of the things that I've always disliked is this weird homogenization of cultures where they go, well, we're over in the East, so we'll just make them all sort of fantasy Chinese, that'll do. When if you go to the East, there are so many more countries and cultures at hand, but the Warhammer equivalents tend to boil it down to one or two things. They simplify everything. Take a look at real world Europe in comparison to the old world. They barely compare, which is one of the reasons why I really like the Empire being broken up into all of its individual cultures a bit more cleanly. So I think this is not just a good thing, I think it's a great thing. Do I have any opinions as to what it should be? Not strongly. So I'm quite happy to see what they're going to do with it. But broadly speaking, the more they add, almost always the happier I'll be. Cathay, I would be much happier being all manner of different cultures with a core culture perhaps sitting over it, spreading its cultural influence elsewhere, with lots of individual cultures on the periphery of that, both surviving or not, depending on individual stories. There's loads of cool stuff that we could do. Some of it would be horrifying and harrowing, other parts would be uplifting and marvelous. But yeah, overall, great.
Yep, and it'll be exciting to see what they do in the future with it. I imagine it's gonna, hopefully, it'll be a people that have a complex relationship with Cathay, because we always like complexity and drama and weirdness.
Yeah, and I love the real world history of that area of the world, and I love so much of their art, their culture. I have a great love of so much of what they've got to offer, and seeing some Warhammer equivalents of some of that would be just beautiful. I'm not sure it'll happen, but I would love it.
Yep, and that brings us to the end of this stream, though we've got just the occasional things to take care of when it comes to things that are coming up. So today is Sunday. So Wednesday, we do have a stream planned, which the lobby will be going up in just a little bit, which is that Vera is actually going to be coming back to join us. And what we're going to be doing is we're going to be fleshing out an elven god. We won't know which god until we get to the start of the stream, because y'all are going to get to help decide on that. But we're basically going to choose from a group of a selection of the least explored elven gods, because there are several of which we know literally nothing. Yeah. And we're going to do a Lorebeards Create stream where we work with y'all to maybe try and build a background and everything around what one of these gods might be like.
I'm really looking forward to it. So I'm hoping it's not going to be one that I've already written a whole bunch of stuff for, because it'll be very hard for me to not just go, what I've written is great. So we'll see where that one lands. It's going to be a super
it would not be Kane. Kane is very fleshed out. It would not be Kane.
Kane's already got tons, but there's some gods over on the Elven Pantheon. In fact, like 3/4 of them, but they've got nothing more than like 6 or 7 sentences, and that's it. And the job will be to flesh that out into a fully formed understanding of what that elf god is for the elves as a whole.
Yeah, we'll be looking at a lot of like your Nethu or your Hukon the Sunderer or Eldrazor. We'll be messing around with that stuff. So we've got that coming up, and then on Friday, more Lawhammer, of course.
Yeah, more pilgrimage.
More pilgrimage. That pilgrimage taking a hot minute. Did you want to talk about the thing that I've been picking you about, or are you not ready yet?
I've not decided how I'm doing it. I'm not decided how I'm doing it yet, so not yet.
Not yet. And then Saturday. Saturday is Rookery coming back?
No, our Rookery doesn't start till the start of next month. We're currently organizing all our guests, one of which will be Vera, who has already confirmed that she'll be coming on. We're currently discussing what we're going to be doing for that. We have already about 14 of them, I think, laid down. So
Hell
we
yeah.
are filling up fast, and the Rookery next season is going to be super fun. We're also going to be streaming out from Tabletop Scotland live one of the evenings, which is going to be super cool. Looking forward to that a lot, but it's coming very soon. We're going to have details going up on the Rookery Patreon over the course of the next week or so. I'm busy getting the rest of the guests in place before we start discussing it all.
I have to grab this one because the fact that someone came in and basically screamed this at the end of the stream amuses me greatly. Do elves have dogs and cats as pets?
Yes.
Yeah, sure.
They do. So, yeah, some of them are big.
Yeah, I don't know why that cracked me up as much as it did. Watchdog 3079, Mathlon. No, Mathlon is way too explored.
Mathlon's got quite a bit. I'd rather go for someone who's got almost nothing. Mathlon's got a lot of stuff out there already.
Yeah, I'll
contradictory stuff.
Yeah, a lot of contradictory stuff, but yeah. All right. Is there anything else you could think of, or is that
Mark and Gork next Sunday after that? So we're going to be doing Mark and Gork next week over on the Warhammer channels, which is going to be super good because we haven't had the greenskins for a wee while, and it's going to be nice to do another godly stream discussing Mark and Gork and just how cunning and brutal or cunning they actually are.
Yeah, and I will be putting up a poll for the next Lorebeards on my channel here in just a little bit. We've already figured out who it is. It's a group of characters, and there are some interesting picks. Yeah, so we'll see you guys when we see you. Thanks so much for watching, and take care.
See you later.
Bye-bye. Bye-bye.